It's WFUV and WFUV HD, New York. Listener supported public media from Fordham, the Jesuit University of New York. Right here on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org. This is One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org.
Everybody, and welcome to another edition of One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. Happy New Year to everybody out there. We're taking you up until 2 a.m. here on the East Coast. We'll be on 90.7 FM, Facebook Live, and YouTube. Happy to have you with us for our first show of 2021, alongside my partner and our producer, Alex Wolz. I am Jimmy Sullivan. Kayla Wenzel will be along with the headlines throughout the next 3 hours. Alex, you're doing it all to start the new year. Happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Same to you, Jimmy. I'm not going to say it's easy, but you know what? This is the situation we're in. I'm happy to be here with you, and I think we're going to have a great show to kick off the new year.
I'm certainly looking forward to it as well. And Alex, we've got a lot to get into over the next 3 hours. We got football, we got basketball, we'll have some baseball, and get into some of our hopes for the new year. But I think we got to start with football. NFL heading into week 17. A lot of different news and notes going on around the league. Jets are locked into the number 2 pick. No need to really talk about them on this show, but we move over to the Giants, and believe it or not, playoff implications for them. They're at 5-10. They get in with a win and a Washington loss this weekend. And Alex, if I would have told you in week 1 or week 2 at the end of this season that the New York Football Giants would be playing for their playoff lives in week 17, I think you probably would have told me that I was crazy. Now, I don't like to put words in your mouth, but I think you probably would have said something to that effect.
I'm going to surprise you here because I picked the Giants to win the division to start the season. I know that's not a hot prediction, but that's what I actually thought. Not with a 6-10 record, but I thought that it would happen. So the situation that we're in here, I think it's interesting with all the things the Giants have gone through and how crazy this division has been with the turnover and obviously losing Saquon Barkley, that we are where we are. But I think if you're the Giants, you get the win, and it's a good season. I don't think you can worry about playoff implications, but I'm not surprised we're here. I got to be honest with you, Jimmy. I did see it coming, just not in this way for sure.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because if you were to pick one division in football that would send somebody to the playoffs at 7-9 or 6-10 before the season, I think it would have had to have been the NFC East.
Absolutely.
And that's the worst division in football by far, and we knew that going into the season. But it's still jarring when they put up these playoff picture graphics on all these games, and they show the teams that are quote unquote in the hunt, and you've got the Arizona Cardinals at 8-7 in the hunt, not in the playoffs right now. And then they pan to the rest of the teams who are technically in the hunt, and you've got the 6-9 Cowboys and the 5-10 Giants in that conversation. And you've got 6-9 Washington, who, if they win on Sunday night, are going to host a playoff game.
I think it's even crazier when you look over at what's going on in the AFC, because you've got teams that are 10-5 fighting for a playoff spot, and then you've got the NFC East of a bunch of 5-6 win teams that are in the same situation. So I think it begs the question of, like, we always talk about restructuring with divisions and conferences, but when you look at a situation like this, even when we expand the playoffs and we're still having this type of conversation, I think it's really fascinating. And it's just incredible with everything we've gone through this year that this is where we are, week 17 with the Giants.
It's incredible. You talk about the AFC. There's going to be a 10-win team left out in the AFC. There may even be an 11-win team left out in the AFC. And we'll see what happens there. Also should touch on the Cleveland Browns just quickly before we move on. They're continuing to work remotely. They had a coach test positive for COVID-19, a bunch of cases there. So we could be having a do or die playoff game on a Tuesday, you guys.
Hey.
This is obviously a serious situation, and I said my best to the individuals who have tested positive, but this could potentially shake up Week 17 depending on what's available and what's there for the Cleveland Browns. But as we move along throughout the 11 o'clock hour into the midnight hour, we will be joined by Sal Licata. He is from WFAN and SNY. Had a good conversation with him. Emmanuel Berbari joined me for that one. Talked a lot of Jets, some Giants, some baseball as well. And then, Alex, we got to get into basketball. Interesting times in New York. It's been a week since we were talking about the Brooklyn Nets as favorites in the East. I think maybe that's taken a hit in the past week or so with some of the injuries and the way they've played. And the New York Knicks are competitive, I think. They've played pretty well. They're 2-3 right now. They're playing again. You will have seen the results of the Knicks game by the time this airs, but they, Alex, have been, I think, impressive under Tom Thibodeau, and you have to give them a lot of credit.
It's hard not to overreact, I should say, to what's going on in the NBA right now, because you have a Nets team that I think has been a success in overall with the Kyrie, KD formula. And you have a Knicks team that, look, I'm not saying they're going to be in the playoffs. I'm not saying they're going to even compete with the top dogs of the league, but they're going to be competitive in general. I think we've seen that, and this is something that we talk about with our later interview, is that this is a team that fights. That's what you're going to get from Tom Thibodeau, and it's going to be entertaining to watch. This is the first time in my life I have an interest in turning on Knicks games without being a Knicks fan, and I think that's a testament to how much they've accomplished, just becoming an interesting team. We don't need to see success. We don't need to see wins necessarily, but this is a team that you could turn on TV and be proud of as a fan, and I think that's the only thing you can ask for after what we've seen from the Knicks these past few years.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I felt that way as well. Probably going back to like 2012, 2013.
That's generous, yeah.
That I can remember back in the good old days when like Steve Novak was on the team.
I do want to give a quick shout out to Carmelo Anthony too, because I'm sure you saw, what is he, 14th now, all-time scoring list. So I think he deserves a lot of respect for New York basketball. Just give him a shout out here.
Yeah, he never got the respect he deserved.
No.
Like when we were in studio, we would get calls sometimes like, complaining about Carmelo Anthony, and I just never understood it.
Not right.
Because there are very few people who are willing to take on that responsibility in New York, and he was one of them. So you have to give him a lot of credit for that. Moving right along, 1 a.m. hour, we'll talk to Kazeem Famuyide from MSG AM. Talked a lot of Knicks with him. A really good interview and a lot of fun we had doing that. And then, Alex, we get to go into college football because last night, Justin Fields against Clemson took a huge hit in the second quarter, and he said, call the ambulance, but not for me. And Ohio State goes ahead, gets a big victory over Clemson. And I think a result that surprised a lot of people last night. Trevor Lawrence going down and Justin Fields moving on to the title game against Alabama.
We are having a more interesting conversation, I think, we're going to have than we were initially, because we were thinking we're going to get a pair of blowouts. There's not really going to be a lot of conversation here, but we were wrong. I think these games, look, the first one, Notre Dame, look, they didn't compete as like what we were kind of expecting, but I think they held their own considering it's a very good Alabama team. And this nightcap, and we were texting a little bit during it, you're just seeing bombs from Justin Fields. And I mean, there was obviously a disrespect. I mean, we could talk more about that later with Dabo, with the narrative of that game, and he just shut all that down. I mean, that was his best game of the season, probably of his career, and I think it's really impressive that Ohio State went out there, all odds pretty much against them, 6 games, nobody believing in them, and they trounced the Clemson team that I've never really seen that happen to before, so excited to talk about that, but what a win, and I'm looking forward to the final, even if Alabama's got a bit of an edge there.
That final taking place on January 11th. In Miami. And then before we wrap up our show, we're going to get into some hopes that we have for New York sports in 2021. And this is a time of resolutions. Alex, I don't know if you have any resolutions for the new year.
Not usually. I just say every year you got to get better, and it's that simple.
There you go. I'm not a huge resolution guy, but I think having a resolution and looking forward to certain things, I think, are two very different things. And we're going to look forward to the year ahead and what we can hope for out of our teams in 2021. It's a time of hope. How long it takes for that to be dashed, who knows? I know that personally as a Jets fan and a Mets fan, but this is a time of new beginnings, and I think there's reason for optimism as we head into 2021. One-on-one taking you up until 2 a.m. here in the East, 90.7 FM, Facebook and YouTube. Going to talk some NFL, some New York Giants football on the other side of this break. Stay with us. You're listening to One-on-One.
Sure to follow WFUV Sports on all of our social media platforms. At WFUV Sports on Twitter, at WFUV_sports on Instagram, and WFUV Sports on Facebook and YouTube. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Welcome back, everybody. One-on-one. Moving right along here in hour number one, taking you up until 2 a.m. 90.7 FM, Facebook, and YouTube. So glad you could unofficially kick off your 2021 with us. I'm Jimmy Sullivan, joined by Alex Wolves. Kayla Wenzel will be along later in the hour with the headlines. And Alex, it's week 17 in the NFL. The New York Jets have nothing to play for. They are 2-13. They will have the number 2 pick. But the New York Giants do. They are 5-10. They've got a shot at the playoffs. There's a chance. It's not impossible. Odds are maybe not great, but Alex, I'm so fascinated looking at this season for the Giants. You could easily finish 5-11, and almost every Giants fan is happy right now, I feel like. This is a team that, played badly last year for Pat Shermer, won, I think, 3 games. They come back this year, not a tangible difference in the record, really, because what's 3-13 versus 5-11, if we're being honest. Mm-hmm. But team that's played more competitively, team that feels like it's found its head coach in Joe Judge. And Alex, I don't know how you look at it. I think a lot of Giants fans, believe it or not, are going to look at this season as a success.
I completely agree. And I think if you look at just in general, this is a different type of 5-11 or 5-10 team, depending on how it plays out, because there's a lot of structure. Like you said there, Joe Judge has without a doubt come in as a coach and brought a certain mentality that's a winning one to this team compared to their brethren in New York and the Jets, which is just a different situation. So I think you look at this, it's a team that even losing what's probably their best player in Saquon Barkley has gone out every week and competed. That's without a doubt. They've been in every game, and Giants fans will tell you that there were games that they could have won, absolutely, and been in maybe a 9-7, 8-8 situation potentially. But in general, the team has competed in every game. They've played every week. They've gotten some big wins and had some tough losses for sure. You're going to get that. But Joe Judge has brought in a mentality, like you mentioned, of a team that's going to compete. And I think he's got some staying power, not only with the Giants, but that this team can really become competitive once they get Barkley and develop Jones even more.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about Joe Judge because I was among a lot of people who was skeptical of him coming in. He had these corny cliches. He was comparing team building to making a sandwich. He was, he didn't strike me as somebody who was going to go over very well in the locker room. That hasn't happened. The team seems to love him. There was a situation a couple weeks ago where he was wearing the Ole Miss bucket hat because he lost a bet with Evan Ingram and he had to deck out in all Ole Miss gear because they had beaten Mississippi State. I think that was the situation. And it seems like he's the right guy for the Giants. That being said, I look at this Giants roster, Alex, and in a lot of places, woefully deficient.
Yeah.
And I think lacking a lot of talent. We saw that last week against Baltimore where they just drove down the field. It felt like the Giants basically didn't have the ball in the first quarter. And, you have the Giants roster probably maxing out in terms of the talent level it has and the results they are getting. And unfortunately, I think that falls on Dave Gettleman. And we'll talk to Sal Licata about this a little later. But I'm not convinced that with the personnel moves Dave Gettleman has made, that he really deserves another shot. I'm skeptical of his abilities as a GM, particularly in the modern NFL. And I don't think he's done a very good job building this roster because we've seen the Giants' deficiencies laid bare pretty much in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in general, you were relying on the draft to really solidify your offensive line, to get that offense in a place where you could create the running lanes and give Jones the time he needs. That hasn't really panned out. You're not seeing a lot there. And I think if you look at that, you're not seeing any notable additions to the Giants roster that makes them compete with the best of the NFL. You're seeing marginal improvements. You're hoping for development from some younger players, but you're not seeing those big moves that are going to make you really compete at a high level. And I think when you look at the NBA in a broad sense, you have a lot of teams that are growing each year, that are making the necessary moves, that are making those steps to compete. And I don't think you're seeing that from the Giants. Now, Jones could develop into a star quarterback. The defense could make some strides, which we've seen this year. They have been much better defensively this season. And we could be having a very different conversation. But I do think it's a fair point to bring up about how Gettleman hasn't necessarily brought this team to a significantly higher level than what we saw last year. And you're relying on a lot of guys to develop that you don't know if that's necessarily going to pan out.
Yeah, a lot of questions there. And I think it's also interesting to point out with the Giants. Very competitive the first 12 games of the season. Well, even though they started 1-7, 5 of those first 7 losses were by 1 score. 8 points or less, basically, was my standard there. Since that Seattle game, which capped off the 4-game winning streak back in early December, they won that game 17-12. Just a great win in Seattle. Like a fantastic win for them with Colt McCoy, their backup quarterback. Since that game, the New York Giants have played the Cardinals, Browns, and Ravens and lost by an average margin of almost 16 points in those 3 games. Now, a couple reasons for that. I think a big reason for it personally is the way they handled, or I should say mishandled, the Daniel Jones situation. He had gotten hurt in the Cincinnati game. He came back against Arizona, clearly could not move, basically. And so much of his game is predicated on running around and read option and stuff like that. And when he couldn't do that, and maybe even worse, couldn't protect himself in the pocket because defense has just been teeing off, that's a big problem for the New York Giants. And I think for as much credit as Joe Judge deserves for making this team competitive and giving them something to play for in Week 17, I think you also have to point out that this was a situation that was mishandled by the Giants coaching staff where they brought back Daniel Jones too soon. And to be honest with you, I think it's going to cost them their season.
I agree with that in a sense. And Colt McCoy, you showed you could win a football game with him. Ultimately, this is not a team that, to me, comes down to what's going on at the quarterback position. It's a team that's about the running game. It's about the defense. You could throw, I'm not going to diminish Daniel Jones or Colt McCoy, but you could throw a lot of different guys at quarterback, and I think they still win games. I don't think it's ultimately about throwing for 200-300 yards and 5 touchdowns. It's nowhere about that. It's about running the ball and really pressuring your opponent and getting points that way. So I think they could have gone with McCoy for another week or two and still had success on that route, as opposed to risking Daniel Jones's future for a season that ultimately isn't that significant in terms of playoffs and in terms of how it pans out. So I think in that sense, it's a bit of a questionable decision. And I get why they want to bring Jones back. You're playing against playoff opponents. You know that you're going to need your best guy out there, but you have to keep the future in mind. And if you're going to get him injured just for a season like this, I don't think that's a risk that's necessarily worth taking.
There's also the more existential question of whether or not Daniel Jones is the Giants franchise quarterback. And I think that's something they need to figure out. He is, if you want to put it in New York terms, a year behind Sam Darnold's curve, basically. And Daniel Jones this season, 13 games, 13 starts, 9 TDs, 9 interceptions. He has averaged just over 200 yards a game. He's productive in the ground game. But in 2 years, the Giants, and this is not all on him, and I'm not looking to put all this on him, but the Giants are 7-18 with him playing the last 2 seasons. Colt McCoy this year started 2 games, I should say, won 1, lost 1. But is Daniel Jones the guy for the Giants? And I'm not sure if we're actually any closer to answering that this year than we were maybe at this point last year. It's because of some of the injuries and the uncertainty and losing Saquon Barkley, I think is part of that as well. But I'll put it to you, Alex. Do you think this is a guy that the Giants can build around, who can be their franchise quarterback, who can be a guy that goes out and wins some games in the future?
I think it's interesting, but it goes back to the point that you brought up earlier about Dave Gettleman, because I don't think you can necessarily place all the blame on Daniel Jones, because if you look at the best quarterbacks in the league, they have good situations around them. I'm going to jump over to my guy, Justin Herbert. The reason why he's doing really well in Los Angeles is not just because of him as a quarterback. It's because of the situation that you're in. Tua, I think, is in a similar boat in Miami. Young quarterbacks in general are going to be at their best when they're in good situations. And I think Sam Darnold's another example of how that's true in a negative way. So you look at this Giants team, you look at this roster, as you identified earlier, this is not a top roster in the NFL. So to say that Daniel Jones is the reason that they're not, winning 9-10 games, I don't think that's fair. But there's also the other side of it where you're not seeing a tremendous amount of development from him. I think from year to year, you're still seeing similar performance. Like you said there, 9 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Those aren't the numbers you really want to see. So there is, I think, 2 sides of it. I think there's an onus on Jones to start throwing the football really at a higher rate and to throw with better accuracy, to stop turning the ball over, particularly in fumbles and in interceptions. I think that's something that every quarterback needs to improve regardless of the situation. So I think there's 2 sides of it where the Giants have to make those roster improvements to become the competitive team that Jones needs around him, and Jones also needs to make those improvements himself. But I've seen enough to be confident with him. I think he's a talented enough quarterback where if you draft somebody, let's say a Zach Wilson of the world or a Justin Fields of the world, I don't think you're significantly better than you are right now. So I think Jones deserves another shot when he gets a better team around him now that he's got the coach as well.
It's also really interesting to look at franchise quarterbacks, who's successful, who's not. Also, we have to look at the context of the last 5 years with first-round draft picks at the quarterback position. This is from Danny Heifetz of The Ringer. Tweeted this out, really eye-opening. So, 2015, there were 2 first-round picks, Jameis and Mariota. Both of them are backups now.
Yep.
2016, same deal. First 2 picks of the 2016 draft for quarterbacks. Jared Goff, maybe. You don't know yet. There's questions about that. And Carson Wentz, who might be under the worst contract in NFL history, which hasn't even started yet. Let's go to 2017. Number 2 pick, Mitch Trubisky. No. Patrick Mahomes, that's a winner. That's a generational quarterback right there. Best in the league right now. Deshaun Watson, also really good. That's a hit. 2018, you had 5 quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield. Depends who you ask.
We'll see
maybe
after tomorrow.
Maybe not. Yeah. Sam Darnold is a no. And Danny writes here for now, which I think is a good way of looking at it. Josh Allen was a hit. Josh Rosen, big time no. Yeah. Lamar Jackson, a hit. He won MVP last year. Then you go to 2019. Kyler Murray, I would say yes. Daniel Jones, who knows? And Dwayne Haskins just got cut. So it's not like there have been quarterbacks, at least a ton of quarterbacks in the last 5 years who have worked out terrifically well. And I think we need to be fair to the Giants there because everybody was calling on them to draft Dwayne Haskins, right?
That is true. Yeah.
You know, back at the time, I was saying, why don't you draft Dwayne Haskins? And Dwayne Haskins is out of the league now, probably for good. And Daniel Jones is an NFL starting quarterback. So I do think we need to give the Giants a little grace here in seeing that, yeah, Daniel Jones isn't working out, but also there's a lot of quarterbacks around the league that have been taken in the last 5 years who just have not panned out very well.
Well, what I would say is look at the situations of the quarterbacks who are successful. You have Mahomes in Kansas City. That's such a good roster now, and it even was back then. You talk about Kyler Murray. They got him the coach that he wanted, Cliff Kingsbury, to specifically work with him. Then you talk about Buffalo. They've always had a solid team, and they've gotten better. They've made some great moves to make that team significantly better. And Baltimore also has a solid coach and a solid roster. So I think you look at who's succeeded, they're in situations that enable them to do that. Where, look at Haskins. I mean, part of it's his own fault, certainly, in his decision-making, but that organization in Washington has been a mess for quite some time. So, and Darnold, obviously the same thing in New York. So a lot of it, I think, stems back to the situation as well as the individual quarterback. And I think Jones is kind of a difficult one to decipher because there's a bit of both to evaluate there.
Absolutely. And we'll see what winds up happening going forward here. We also don't know if Jason Garrett's going to be back. The offensive coordinator for the Giants, that's a big if. I wouldn't say he's done a great job this year, to be honest. But that's another question the Giants need to answer. But that's the offseason. Giants still have something to play for. So let's look at week 17, Alex, before we wrap up here. You picked the Giants preseason. You were, I think, more right about that than a lot of people. They're here. They're 5-10, but they're here. Do you think they get the win? They're playing Dallas at 1:00. This is the national game, by the way, tomorrow in that time slot. Yes. So do the Giants get the win against Dallas, which is the only thing they can control tomorrow in their pursuit for the NFC East?
Well, Dallas has actually played a lot better these past few weeks, so this is certainly no cupcake game. I'm going to take the Giants. I have to stick by my pick, and I also think the Giants, they understand that there's something to play for here. I think they want to win this game. They want a shot at that playoff. I really do think so, and Joe Judge just said, don't think about that, just think about the game, and the Giants are going to do that. I think they have a lot in their hands here, and they can control it. So I think the Giants get the win. It's that night game that's really the question because look, I mean, the football team and the Eagles, I mean, it's crazy to say that you're rooting for the Eagles, but look, I mean, it's going to be a fun game. I'm definitely going to be watching that one. I don't know. Who do you think in that one, Jimmy? Because I think that's actually the more interesting game than the Giants game, personally.
Yeah, I feel a heck of a lot better about Washington with Alex Smith under center than Dwayne Haskins right now. I just think, that Washington defense is playing so well.
That's the thing, yeah.
And that's a huge deal, right? Chase Young's going to be the defensive rookie of the year. The secondary's been really good, which is kind of an island of misfit toys out there, but they've been playing really well. And look, they need Alex Smith to get in there and not do anything really stupid with the football. And if they do that, I think they're going to win. The way their defense is playing, the way they're coached, they, let's remember, had a chance in that game on Sunday with Dwayne Haskins starting and Taylor Heineke backing him up. And it's nothing against those two guys because they're NFL pros, but you feel better with Smith coming back. And Smith's been weirdly productive when he's been in the lineup as well. I think that's part of it. I think this is what I think is going to happen tomorrow. I'm going to go with Dallas in the first game because I like the way they're playing. Andy Dalton is playing well, which is weird to say, but their defense has been better. They're using their weapons better. So I'm going to go with Dallas in the first game. Also, I'm not convinced Daniel Jones is fully healthy, which is, I think, a big part of it. But I'm going to take Washington on Sunday Night Football, and I think they make it to the playoffs. The Eagles have something to play for in the sense of, one, playing spoiler, and two, Doug Peterson may well be coaching for his job. So that'll be really interesting to watch how exactly they come out of the gate. But I think you get Dallas at 7-9. I think you get Washington at 7-9. Washington gets the tiebreaker, and they get to go play Tom Brady in the first round of the playoffs.
There we go.
So that's what I'm going with. Give me the football team on Sunday Night Football. I'm sorry.
Who thought we'd be saying that, really?
You know what's funny? Before we go to headlines here, isn't there like kind of a weird brand now with the football team
I
a little
love it.
bit?
I love it. Absolutely. Something about it just rolls off the tongue. Like if you were to put a different, like a New York football team, that doesn't work. But when you say the Washington football team, I don't know why, but there's something about it that just rings.
There's a weird like class to it almost.
Exactly. Yeah.
As weird as that's like, I look at the end zones when they play at home and it says like Washington established whatever year, and I'm like, that looks like professional. It's also because I'm not used to professionalism out of that franchise, which
There you go.
is also a big part of it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll see where this goes from here. But I think Washington makes it to the playoffs. And coming up next, we'll get into some headlines, some football, some baseball to get into as well as we kick off the new year. Kayla Wenzel joins us next. We'll be back after this.
One-on-One has a brand new YouTube channel. Subscribe to WFUV Sports to catch our simulcast Saturday nights and get notifications so you never miss another show. Miss the show? You can find on-demand segments, interviews, and highlights every week. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Everyone, welcome back to One-on-One. I'm Kayla Wenzel alongside Jimmy Sullivan and Alex Walls. So guys, we're going to start with a few headlines here, and we're going to begin with baseball. So the San Diego Padres came out swinging this past week with two major trades for right-handed ace Yu Darvish and Cy Young winner Blake Snell. These are really big moves in an offseason where many other teams are tentative, either because of the current economics of the game or the uncertainty over the upcoming season. But it seems like the Padres are really positioning themselves to be a big threat to the reigning champion Los Angeles Dodgers. So Jimmy, I'll start with you. What do you think of these moves, and what kind of impact do you think they're going to have on the National League West?
Well, they're going for it. We know that. And I love it. I love what the Padres have done here. They are absolutely right, I think, Kayla, in saying that they want to be a threat to the Dodgers. I think the only thing that holds them back, to be honest, is that they're playing the Dodgers. If we're looking at a full season, 19 times in a year, I don't know what exactly next season is going to look like because there's been conjecture about that. But you have to love it. I mean, you get Blake Snell, who's a Cy Young Award winner, who we saw pitching great in the World Series until he wasn't. And then you've got Yu Darvish, who finished second in the Cy Young voting. Granted, a 60-game season, but still a really good pitcher. And this is, I think, how you're supposed to behave when you are close to being a real title contender, right? They've got a great lineup. Manny Machado, Fernando Tatis Jr. You could go on and on. They can hit. They just got Ha-Seong Kim as well from the KBO. But when you are close to what you think you can be, which is a championship contender, and you think a move or two will get you over the top, you go do it. And they had huge capital on the farm, and they went and used it and brought in two of the best pitchers in the game in so doing. So hats off to the Padres. I think it's a great move. Great couple of moves, I should say. If I was to pick right now, I would probably still take the Dodgers because I think they're a bit better. But still, I would be pulling for the Padres if they played each other because I love what they did And I think they're doing all the right things when you're a young up and coming team and you're slowly becoming a title contender.
Yeah, I completely agree with that because I think you have to commend the Padres for what they did because in a market that's been so slow, they come out here and just one morning it seems like they woke up and said, "We're going for it." And that's exactly what they did. And I think you have to respect that. But I'm complete with Jimmy. The problem is you're going to be in the shadow of the Dodgers the entire time because look, I mean, they've been in the wild card last year. They won that game, got knocked out by the Dodgers, but there's going to have to come a point where you have to win this division in order to really make a run at the World Series. And I don't know if this is enough to catapult them to that, if this is good enough to pass the Dodgers, but you have to compete with them. I mean, the Dodgers have a big window here. They just loaded up last season with obviously Mookie Betts, and they've got a lot of young guys that I think they're going to be around for a long time. So that window's not really closing anytime soon. So I think if you're the Padres, you have to say, we got to do what we got to do. We have to bolster our rotation. We need to get those guys, and Manny Machado is obviously the prime example of that, so we can really start at least competing because you can't just sit back and let the Dodgers take this division and take the NL crown every year. You have to fight, and I think that's absolutely what the Padres are doing, and you have to commend them for that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to be said still because the Dodgers haven't really started any of their trading yet. You still don't know what they're doing about Justin Turner and the likes. So I think that I would be optimistic if I was a Padres fan. I think things are looking up for them for sure. I'm not sure that I'm ready to say that they're going to be the best yet. I think the Dodgers still have a lot to offer and a lot still that they're deciding on that could really make their roster. But I also think this is interesting. I mean, most other teams are not really making any moves right now. Like it's a fairly unaggressive market currently. And so I really like this like tenacity by the Padres to come out here and say, hey, we're taking two big pitchers and we're going to take them to our team. I mean, granted, they traded a lot from their farm to get them, but I don't know. I think it's going to end up being worth it. And I really like the spunk about it.
Yeah, and if I could bring us to the negative side here, I hate what this says about baseball right now because you've got a team in the Rays who is literally 2 games away from winning a championship. And they're trading off Blake Snell. They traded Jose Alvarado to the Phillies the other day in a big 3-team deal. They may trade Kevin Kiermaier. They could trade other pieces as well. We don't know what's going to wind up happening with them. But they, as much as I hate to say it, probably a one-off of them going to the World Series this year just because of the way they operate that franchise. Cubs, it's a different situation. The Cubs make me probably even more angry because you have an owner in Tom Ricketts who is a multi-billionaire who, as much as he will try, I don't think can really cry poverty here. And you won the World Series in 2016. You competed for a championship the year after. And then things have obviously gone on a downward trajectory ever since. But here you are, obviously in a pandemic. Everybody's wallet is tighter. I get that. But Theo Epstein stepped down, basically said this was coming. Theo Epstein was the smartest guy in the room, and then he left it. And then the Cubs ship Yu Darvish to San Diego. They get some prospects back, sure. But what we see in other sports is that teams that feel like they're good, feel like they're a piece or two away, they go for it. And what we're seeing in baseball is teams that are decent to good, feel like they're a piece or two away, they sell. And that's where we're at in baseball right now. And I just hate what it says about baseball that these are great players. Like Blake Snell is one of the best pitchers in the league. Yu Darvish was one of the best pitchers in the league last year. Whether he can sustain that level of performance, who knows? But it just annoys me that it takes a team like the Padres who have an owner who's willing to take advantage of other teams' inactivity, a general manager who is a rock star and literally does not have any risk aversion, it seems, to expose the fact that there are most of the other teams who are just willing to punt, if you will, and cry poor because we're in a pandemic and they played 60 games and they played 30 home games last year and there were no fans. That really bothers me. And that was really my first reaction when I saw both of those moves.
That's interesting. And I think the point that you bring up that jumps out at me is look at what's happened to the last few World Series contenders and champions. If you think back to the Cubs, they basically fell off a cliff, and they said that this trade, getting rid of Yu Darvish, was partially made to keep the team relevant. That was what they're trying to do. And for a team that just won the World Series to say that, I mean, there's your reaction. It's mind-boggling. And you even think about your Mets. They were in the World Series a few years ago, collapsed. The Royals won the World Series, collapsed. The Red Sox, they fell apart for other reasons, but I mean, look at all these teams that win the World Series one year or are right on the doorstep, and the next year they're barely even scratching the playoffs. So I think it's an interesting question about baseball in general. When you have such long contracts, such big money that you're dealing with, and you're asking to invest in these players for year after year after year, yet the shelf life of these teams in terms of being competitive is so short. And I think that's part of why you're seeing a lot of these guys on competitive teams just wanting to leave, because you get that window and then you're kind of done. And I think that's what we're seeing with Blake Snell. That's what we're seeing with a guy like George Springer. That's what we're seeing even with DJ LeMahieu. I know he wants to go back to the Yankees, but I don't think he really mind going somewhere else, because there's the window, and then that window suddenly closes and you kind of want to go somewhere else and compete. So I think it's kind of an interesting narrative about baseball that when you have these top teams, I think that's an interesting point, Jimmy, that are either competing in the World Series or winning the World Series that can't really last more than a year. I think one of the only exceptions to that is the Dodgers, which happens to be the team that the Padres are going to be going up against.
Yeah, and if I could just say one more thing before maybe we move on here, I can't entirely blame the teams here. Some of this is also on Major League Baseball.
Sure.
Because let's be real, and you touched on it, Kayla, there's a ton of uncertainty about the upcoming season. We don't know how many games there's going to be. DH in the National League, we don't know how that's going to go. And we don't know if there's going to be an expanded playoffs, because it's a very different conversation. If you're a team that's slightly over 500 and it's a 10-team playoff, you're thinking sell. If it's a 16-team playoff, you're thinking, okay, we can maybe make a run at this. So I think a lot of this is also on Major League Baseball, because, when sports announce major rule changes, they're usually months out ahead of it, right? And baseball, we're sitting here theoretically a month out from spring training. We don't think that's going to happen probably, but nonetheless, we're sitting here and we don't know what a lot of the big rules are going to be. So I think that's also created an environment where teams are not going to go out and spend a ton of money, A, because of the issues with the pandemic, but B, because they don't know exactly how to deploy some of the guys in their roster. Like, look at the Mets. I mean, Dominic Smith is a guy who would be a great DH if they have the DH. If not, does his value drop? Yeah, it does. So I think this is also partially on the sport for creating an environment where nobody actually knows really what's going on for next season. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah, I agree, Jimmy. And I think that you're right in that it's partially the MLB as a league and an organization, but it's also partially the teams. I mean, we've seen this for years past, even before the pandemic, that, like you said, all these World Series teams that were great one year are suddenly not that great the next. So there is definitely a different mindset, I think, when it comes to MLB about the offseason. It doesn't seem like people always have that drive to be the best, not just one year, but the best every year. And I really think that we don't see that except for the Dodgers, which is unfortunately who the Padres are going against. But I think that that's exciting for them, that they're finally coming back. They're ready to make a run. They're risky. They don't know exactly what 2021 is going to be like, but they're saying, we're here for it. However it's going to be, we want to play. So I really do like their mindset, and I think that it is an exciting time to be a Padres fan. But we are going to move over now to talk a little bit about football. So COVID continues to just wreak havoc on the NFL, really. The Miami Dolphins quarterback, Ryan Fitzpatrick, who came in during the fourth quarter on December 26th to help lead the Dolphins to victory, is now forced to sit out following a positive COVID test. The Dolphins are playing the Bills this weekend, and they're going to clinch a playoff berth with a win. And additionally, then Alvin Kamara of the Saints just tested positive on Friday for COVID. So he's missing a crucial game for the Saints this weekend as they're working to get the number 1 seed in the NFC. So Alex, we'll go with you this time. If you're Miami, what are you doing about your quarterback position? And if you're the Saints,
no, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. How does
finish
Kamara also affect your game plan?
Yeah, so I think that the Miami dynamic between Fitzpatrick and Tua is the most fascinating part of the season. I know people might not care about this, and my dad's a Dolphins fan, so I watch this stuff kind of closely, and it's unbelievable to me that you have this guy in Tua that is He's your draft pick. He's your future quarterback. He's the guy that you're investing in, and you pull him out of the fourth quarter of like your most important games because you don't have confidence in him. I think that's so concerning. But a situation like this might actually be what Miami kind of needs to get a little confidence in him because they've got the toughest matchup this week of all those teams that are fighting to get into the AFC playoffs with the Bills. And Tua's going to have to show up to win that game. He can't just hide and only throw 150, 200 yards, maybe a touchdown or two. He's going to have a big game because that's what Josh Allen's going to bring to the table. That's what the Bills are going to bring to the table. So I think not having Fitzpatrick is going to give him a little bit of confidence to say, hey, I'm the guy now, and might actually have to be in the playoffs too if they get there. So in that sense, I actually think it's kind of interesting to see what happens with Miami, where almost like their safety net is going to be gone this week in Ryan Fitzpatrick, which it's interesting to see how that's going to play out. And I think Kamara, I mean, you talk about his impact. I mean, he just had 6 touchdowns in a game, and now he's not going to be there potentially for the playoffs. So the Saints are always been a versatile team. I think they're going to be able to work with that and withstand his loss, but certainly that's a big impact that you can't overstate.
I don't know if I've ever seen a dynamic like Miami where Tua will start a game and Fitzpatrick's like always ready to come out of the bullpen basically whenever he gets into trouble. Like, I really think just for this, I think Brian Flores is the coach of the year with Miami. So hats off to him. But I will say this. You look at Fitzpatrick, you look at Kamara. These are two teams that right now are in the playoffs. And I was always going to be really curious because the NFL is not using a playoff bubble and they're not, taking the steps that other leagues have to stop COVID. I was always curious what would happen if there was a big game, a playoff game, and a major player would be out. And Alvin Kamara is one of the best offensive players in football. Ryan Fitzpatrick, you wouldn't put him on that level, obviously, but he's extremely important to what the Dolphins do. And it's one thing for week 17. Everyone has been dealing with COVID all season long. The NFL has had a number of inconsistencies in terms of how it handles it, in terms of pushing back games, not pushing back games. And then you have the Broncos playing with no quarterbacks and the Browns playing with no receivers. But it's so strange when I'm looking ahead to the playoffs, and the Saints are probably going to be playing on the first weekend. The Dolphins, if they win, will be playing in the first weekend. If both of these guys, let's just say, are out, but they could be back on a Monday or a Tuesday, what do you do? And this is, I think, the really fascinating thing that I'm looking out for with the NFL, because we kind of figured this would happen. Like, as terrible as this sounds, with cases spiking across the country, with the dynamics we're looking at, I hate to say it was bound to happen, but you feel that way. And you look at these two guys, hugely important players. What happens if they're out? I don't know. And I don't know if the NFL will make concessions for the Saints or the Dolphins. I don't know how that's going to look. But it's something to monitor as the playoffs go along. Like, you could lose, the star quarterback or the star running back, whoever it may be, to COVID, a day or two before the game, and that's it. And you're just out of luck.
No, yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting point. And it will be interesting to see if, like, Ryan Fitzpatrick gets the same treatment as Alvin Kamara. Like, if the NFL moves the Saints game, but maybe doesn't move the Dolphins game. Like, if the Saints play on Saturday of next week, then Kamara's out. He can't play. But if they play on Sunday, like, assuming he stays asymptomatic, he could play. So I don't know if they're going to take that into account. They haven't made the schedule yet. They haven't released it if they have made it. So I think that is going to be really interesting, like you said, to just monitor the inconsistency of it and how are they going to react to this. And I think that it's also interesting because the Saints offense is so based around running, around rushing. And so, like, without Kamara, and Brees is still not 100%. They're passing the fewest in the league right now. I wonder if that is going to affect their game, if they have to go into the playoffs without him. How much is that going to hurt?
I think
a
couple of good points. Jimmy, when you talk about that thing with the Broncos earlier, that's exactly what Kayla just made me think of, is that the Broncos, they made them run out on the field without a quarterback. And the Ravens-Steelers game, they pushed it back almost a week to make sure that could happen. So that type of dynamic, Jimmy, I think it's going to be interesting to watch. And then also Kamara, obviously, his impact can't be understated either.
Yeah, I mean, Drew Brees is a liability right now. Yeah. Like, as crazy as that sounds, I mean, Alvin Kamara scored 6 TDs in a game. The Saints scored 7. Drew Brees didn't score any of them. So let's just remember that. And, when the Broncos played the Saints, I mean, not only did the Broncos not have any quarterbacks, but the Saints ran Taysom Hill out there. So it's not like they really had any quarterbacks either. So it's really interesting to look at. And I remember before the season, Phillip Rivers, I think, had said something to the effect of, well, if we're in the Super Bowl and I test positive for COVID, like, could I still play? And everybody was like making fun of him at the time because it's like, it sounds stupid, but it's actually a conversation that could come up, because you sit there and you say, like, could something like that happen? Yeah, something like that could happen. And you've got 2 weeks before the Super Bowl to basically put people in bubble wrap. So, maybe you do that. But I mean, this is where we're at right now. And look, we're playing sports in a pandemic, and this is unfortunately the stuff that we're dealing with. And, before a big playoff game, could you lose somebody to it? Yeah, you could. But how that gets handled at the NFL level, I think, is the most curious part of this, because they have, frankly, been letting the tail wag the dog here for a while, where, it's one set of guidelines for one team. It's another set of guidelines for another team. Oh, we're going to shift the schedule. We're going to play you on Tuesday. We'll play you on Monday. I don't know what this is going to look like for the NFL in the playoffs, but we do know that they're going to crown a champion. Whether that winds up on schedule, who knows? But I think we all know how this ends. Now, how we get there, I think, is going to be very, very interesting as we progress through the playoffs.
You have to think that the Super Bowl is going to have the tightest bubble the NFL's ever worked with, because, I mean, Roger Goodell has kind of thrown around that idea and kind of dismissed it at certain points of doing like a full-on bubble like we saw in the NBA or something of that nature. But look, I think that's the worst case scenario that you just brought up, Jimmy, is that if, let's say, a Phillip Rivers, not that the Colts are going to be in the Super Bowl, but if someone of his caliber were to test positive for COVID the day before the game, I don't think the Super Bowl is something you can push back a week or two like that. That doesn't seem like something the NFL is interested in doing, between the TV deals and the sponsors and the transportation, and how complicated of a setup that is. Even in a year like this, there's going to be some fans there. There's going to be some sort of setup for the Super Bowl. I don't expect the NFL to say, oh, this guy that has COVID, we're just going to stop the game and cancel it. I think they're going to have to really tighten up and make sure that a situation like we saw in the World Series with Justin Turner does not happen before the game, because I think that's ultimately the worst case scenario for the NFL, is if you put all this work into getting a season done, crawling to the finish line, getting to the Super Bowl, which is ultimately all you need to do in the end, and something were to happen to blow it all up. So I think that the NFL has to understand that, keep that in mind. Cases like this are going to happen probably, but once we get to the Super Bowl, I think they have to prevent that, because that would be a travesty for the league.
Yeah, and just one more thing before we wrap it. It's funny because I was, looking into, well, what would happen if you pushed it back a week? I don't know if you could do that. Some of the other, it's funny because a lot of the issues actually arise from some of the NFL's broadcast partners. Like, I think Fox, I want to say, is it the Daytona 500 the week after, like something big. I think the Grammys is the week before and the Oscars is later next year. So it's fine. But like, there's so much of how, CBS and NBC and Fox like schedule things out is around the Super Bowl, right? They'll put things like right after or before that. Nobody is going up against the Super Bowl, right? So there's wide ranging programming notifications if they push it back to President's Day weekend, which they will not do this year. Like, they're going to play this game come hell or high water at the date and time in which it's going to be played, because quite frankly, they have to. So we'll see what winds up happening with the NFL. Unfortunately, I don't think this is really surprising, at least anymore, just with what's going on around the country. Kayla, thank you for those headlines. We'll have you back later in the show. Coming up next, we'll talk to Sal Licata. Emmanuel Barbari and I sit down with the host from WFAN and SNY on the other side of this break. Stay with us.
Support the WFUV Sports Department. Visit support.wfuv.org to become a member or make a one-time donation. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
It's WFUV HD, New York. Listener-supported public media from Fordham, the Jesuit University of New York. Right here on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org. This is New York's longest-running sports call-in show on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org.
Welcome back to One-on-One, New York's longest-running sports call-in show. We're pleased to have a special guest on the show today. It's Sal Licata. You hear him on WFAN, you see him on SNY, and he's recently joined the podcast team at the New York Post, talking New York Knicks. Sal, appreciate a few minutes here. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, Emmanuel. I appreciate it. And Jimmy, you guys, it's fun to have some time here to talk some New York sports. Looking forward to it.
So, of course, on the forefront of a lot of New York sports fans' minds lately is the Jets situation. They potentially missed out on the opportunity to draft Trevor Lawrence. And last night, you see Justin Fields absolutely light it up in a showdown with that same quarterback prospect. So, Sal, you put the GM cap on right now. You're Joe Douglas. Where are you with the whole stay the course of Sam Darnold or draft Justin Fields situation?
Yeah, it's a difficult decision to make, and a lot more goes into it than just saying, oh, look at Justin Fields and what he did against Clemson, and who knows what he's going to do in the national championship game. That could either further rise his stock or obviously maybe bring it back a little bit. I think Joe Douglas is in a position of power, and it was never to me about just having the number one pick and getting Trevor Lawrence. It's not, if they don't get Trevor Lawrence, it's a disaster. What are the Jets going to do? No, that's nonsense to me. They still have 2 first-round picks. They have a boatload of picks. Joe Douglas is a guy who the Jet fans have no choice but to trust, but I actually do trust that he's going to pick the right players. For me, it's more important who the head coach is. I don't know where he's going to go or who he's going to look at to bring in a head coach, but I think that's more important. If you're focusing just on that second pick, I think you can build a team. Let's say they take the lineman from Oregon and you pair him Sewell. You pair him with Becton, and now you're starting to build one of the better offensive lines in the NFL. You've seen what the Colts can do with that, even without a quarterback. You can win without having a great quarterback. So can Sam Darnold be a winning quarterback at the NFL level? I would like to see what coach they bring in and what pieces they put around him. I think that's still yet to be determined. If he believes that Justin Fields or any other quarterback, though, is a can't miss in his mind, and this is a guy we have to build our franchise around, then you take the quarterback. If you don't, if you have any doubts whatsoever about Fields or anybody else, then you either take the best player available or you trade down, because now that number 2 pick, thanks to Fields having a big game against Clemson, now that number 2 pick is going to have much more value, I would think, from other teams who desperately need a quarterback.
Sal, let's stay on the Jets here. And you talked about the head coach, which is, I think, a really good point. And everybody basically knows that on Sunday night or Monday morning, Adam Gase is going to be gone. But without the number 1 pick and a number of high-profile coaching vacancies around the league, how concerned are you about the Jets maybe missing out on some of the high-end head coaching candidates and maybe not getting somebody as good just because they don't have the number 1 pick and it might not be as attractive of an opening?
Well, you'd have to tell me the guy. I mean, you're telling me Jacksonville is more of attractive of an opening than New York City? I have a hard time believing that, even with – you're right, Jimmy. Some people are going to say that, well, Trevor Lawrence is going there, therefore makes it more attractive, similar to what Arizona did with Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury. And I didn't like that move by Arizona, and I'm still waiting for it to pay dividends exactly. It's not like Arizona's lighting the world on fire with their brilliant offense. So I don't know. I mean, it depends on the guy. Let's just say Urban Meyer, right? Who he's a name who's coming out there, and he's obviously one of the biggest names if he is available. Let's just say he's the guy, and both the Jets and the Jaguars want him. Is he going to look at Jacksonville as a premier destination to New York just because of Trevor Lawrence? Because that's the only reason you can possibly sell me that Jacksonville will be more enticing than New York, assuming, usually the biggest deal with the head coach is taking these jobs is ownership. So assuming that each spot ownership in Jacksonville is very good with Khan, maybe they don't like what they hear from the Jets. Maybe they do. Maybe you hear from the Johnson ownership that you could do whatever you want. Joe Douglas is our guy. We're getting out of the way here, and this is his team. So that to me is the most important thing. But if you're comparing New York to really anywhere else, but more specifically Jacksonville, I would think New York wins every time. I know I'm biased. I'm from here. I'd rather win and be in New York than succeed anywhere else in the world. But that's just me. So I think it comes down to the two things. The biggest thing, the individual, the ownership situation, and then looking at where the team is at. But it's not like the Jets are in a bad spot. They have salary cap space. They have all these top picks. And they do technically have a quarterback in Sam Darnold, who a lot of people in the profession, whether it's college football or pros, still believe Sam Darnold could play.
Sal Licata, our guest here on One. Sal, so let's say the Jets decide against keeping Sam Darnold and they reset that quarterback clock once again. Justin Fields, of course, solidified himself as an option last night. Would you be wary of some of these quarterback handicappers now where Fields all of a sudden becomes the option where Lawrence was a week ago, and then now if he drops a dud against Alabama, all of a sudden Fields could be dropping into the afterthought category again? Where do you stand with the whole quarterback prospect scenario?
I think you just nailed it, Emmanuel. That's why I think it's laughable that everybody says, oh, Trevor Lawrence is a can't miss and he's going to change the franchise and this and that. Because you're right. We've been down this road before. Goff and Carson Wentz, right, where nobody at the time said that those two were going to go back-to-back 1 and 2 or that they were going to be that high. And then all of a sudden you get close to the draft and they sneak up to the top of the board. You had Baker Mayfield in that Sam Darnold draft going number 1, where that wasn't always going to be the case. People were talking about Rosen or Josh Allen and then Darnold himself. And then Baker Mayfield all of a sudden goes 1. So it changes like the wind. I don't think they know what they're talking about. So, yes, I would be wary. You can't just go based off of one game now. Wow, Justin Fields looked tremendous. Now, he did. He opened my eyes, but I'm not watching game film on Justin Fields every day of the week. I'm not doing that. I'm sorry. So I watch him in that big spotlight, and I'm thinking to myself, how could Trevor Lawrence be that much more highly touted than this kid who just made every throw possible? The deep throws, over the middle throws, makes big plays with his legs. A caller last night to my overnight show compared him to Russell Wilson. I thought it was an excellent comparison, specifically running the football. Fields also taking the hit and being able to stay in the game after that, showing extreme toughness. So I watch that and I think to myself, I don't see the disparity that everybody's saying with Justin Lawrence compared to Fields. However, you don't want to react to just one game. And like you said, if he goes out there and lays an egg in the national championship game, are people then going to get off of the Justin Fields bandwagon? But no question he opened some eyes. But to answer the question, I would be wary of how these teams go about evaluating these quarterbacks. They don't always get it right. That's why it's not a given that just because you have the number 1 pick, all of a sudden your franchise is safe.
Being that you are wary about the quarterback situation in the draft, beyond Trevor Lawrence, which seems to be changing all the time. Let's say hypothetically the Jets stick with Sam Darnold here, and he's had a year where he's been up and down this season, I think, to put it charitably. How much of this do you think is Sam Darnold really struggling and maybe he just doesn't have it, to be an NFL quarterback? How much of it do you also think is maybe the coaching and the situation he's been put in? Like, do you think Sam Darnold could be a lot better next year in maybe a better environment with better coaching and maybe even with better weapons?
I do, but Sam Darnold has to take it. The one thing I'll say about Sam Darnold that I don't love about him, he has not proven to be an alpha male. He has zero confidence right now. Now, there are reasons for that. Maybe his personality is such where he's almost too nice. I don't want a guy who's too nice. Josh Allen, you look at him and people say his arrogance or his confidence, his cockiness. Well, look at the way he plays. You know what? Sometimes that translates to good play on the field. So I want to see more of an alpha male attitude from Sam Darnold, more nastiness, maybe be a little mean and cocky and arrogant. Now, to have that confidence, sometimes you have to have success. Sam Darnold has not been in a position to succeed. Therefore, whatever confidence he may have had going into the Jet situation has been taken away because of all that's gone on. A lot of it's on him because no matter what the circumstances are around you, you can't lose that confidence. He's also been hurt and gotten sick with the mono. He's been unlucky at times, but it also is the system around him. He has a head coach that is inept as far as how to build a football team. He's dealt with Todd Bowles for a year. Then he had Adam Gase. So, and he hasn't really had a legitimate roster around him. He's shown games. He's had flashes in certain games. The Cowboys game a year ago comes to mind where you watch him play and you're thinking, man, they have this guy. You know, this is not Christian Hackenberg or Bryce Petty. He can play. So it's got to be the right circumstance. But I do think he takes a little bit of a hit for not, you know, we can knock Baker Mayfield for some of his performance, and he's been up and down and inconsistent throughout his young NFL career so far. You don't doubt his unwavering confidence and his attitude and his leadership ability. With Sam Darnold, that, however, is not there. So that's where I would put a knock on him. I do think the right coach, the right system could still save him and have him win some games at the NFL level.
Sal, tomorrow afternoon, surprisingly, some playoff implications in town. You have the Giants and the Cowboys and a potential outside path for the Giants to sneak in as a division winner into the NFC playoff picture. If you're a Giants fan sitting down for that game tomorrow afternoon, what's the mindset for you? Are you actively rooting for that division crown, or, hey, a lot of discussion has been had about the draft pick scenario? Do they go up? Do they go down? What does this mean for the future trajectory of the franchise in your mind?
Yeah, it's an interesting game as far as the future goes. I think this would stamp a solid year one in Joe Judge if they could get a win, regardless what happens with the Washington-Philadelphia game. So they have to look at it individually and say, we need to do what we can do, and that's go beat the Cowboys, get our fourth division win of the year, and finish a strong 6-10, considering where they started 1-7 or whatever it was. That would be, to me, a solid season, finishing 6-10, and also going at the end of the year. What'd you expect from the Giants? Did you expect more than 6 wins? I don't think I did. The only concern I would have would be the development of Daniel Jones. Now, I look at him as a quarterback he's never going to be top 5 quarterback, but he's a quarterback who can win some games. And if they can run the football and build on the way that they've started to run the football this year and play defense the way that they've played defense this year, they're going to be a team to be reckoned with in the NFC. I don't see any reason why next year they can't be a team that legitimately contends for a playoff spot or, you know, win a division at 10-6 as opposed to 6-10. So I think this is an important game for this year just to stamp home what I thought was a solid year one as far as building the foundation with Joe Judge and then Daniel Jones to a lesser extent. Joe Judge showed me more than Daniel Jones did. I think he needs to have a big year next year. If they win the game and don't make the playoffs, so what? That happens. There's nothing they can do about that. If they win and get in the playoffs, great. And then they give their fans a playoff game. And that's all you could ask for as a fan. I don't understand the fans' logic. And I haven't really heard it that they want to root for the team to lose and not make the playoffs because they want a higher draft pick. Obviously, I heard it with the Jets all year long. I also don't agree with that philosophy. Rooting for your team to lose doesn't make any sense. That kind of goes against, it's a complete opposite of what being a fan is. If you're a fan of a team, you root for that team to win. End of story. I worry about I've never, as much as I would hate a team or be frustrated at a team in season, that, you know, a team that I love rooting for, I never root against them when it comes down to it. So I can't imagine any Giant fan not being so excited in what is an essential playoff game against the hated Dallas Cowboys tomorrow afternoon, how they can't get locked into that game. And not only for the moment of that game and what it means, beating the Cowboys, a team who was shown, you know, to improve here as the year has gone on. You beat a division rival, have a chance to win a division later on in the day, and you have some excitement with that Sunday Night Football game, but also about the future and knowing that in a big game, even with Daniel Jones being somewhat limited, dealing with the injuries, Joe Judge and his club showed up, beat a Cowboys team who you could argue is more talented, more explosive, and got themselves to 6-10 in year one in what is a foundational year for Joe Judge and the Giants.
And Sal, speaking of the future of the Giants, one of the decisions they're going to have to make in the offseason is the future of Dave Gettleman and whether or not he stays in charge in that front office. There's no doubt this Giants team's playing better than it was last year. They're obviously a lot more competitive, but do you think Dave Gettleman, with what he has done in that front office, has done enough to justify giving him another year in charge of the personnel in the organization, basically.
Yeah, I do. Now, have I loved every draft pick that Dave Gettleman has made? No, I hated Saquon Barkley at number 2, especially at the time. I would never take a running back second overall. The only way you can maybe convince me is to say it's the final piece. You know, a good team has a bad year because, let's say, the quarterback gets injured. Somehow they find themselves with a top 5 pick and they take a running back because that was the final piece. That's the only way maybe you could sell it to me. Otherwise, it makes no sense whatsoever. So I hated that draft pick. Obviously, he's missed on others. He missed on hiring the head coach with Pat Shurmur. I thought his biggest failure was misreading the team that he inherited. So he made some mistakes, as all GMs do. Nobody's perfect. But he did hit on Daniel Jones. He did hit on Joe Judge. Those two, regardless of what Giants fans think, those two aren't going anywhere. So unless Dave Gettleman wants to walk away because of his age or because of his health, and I don't think that that's the case. I look at Dave Gettleman as a passionate guy who wants to see this thing through and at least be there to see the Giants achieve some of that success. Winning a division this year, yeah, it would be an accomplishment, but you know what I mean? It's not a real, at 6-10, you win a division, you fall into it. You want to win a division and have a consistent regular season and really feel like your team is headed in the right direction with consistent winning. If this goes right according to plan, starting with next year, the New York Giants, led by Joe Judge and Daniel Jones, should be consistent contenders for playoff spots in the NFC. And I think that's what Dave Gettleman wants to see it through. Build that defense, build that ground game and offensive line inside, out, build inside the trenches, maybe find an explosive playmaker, which they can use. You know, they traded Odell Beckham Jr., sure, and I think that was the right move, and I give Gettleman credit for that because it wasn't an easy move, but it was the right move. So he's had some good ones, and then they need some weapons, as we said. They obviously need some work, but I don't think, based on the entire resume here, which isn't even that big, it's not a long resume. You got to be patient. I do think he deserves to stay because he now got the head coach right and found the quarterback when, you know, a lot of people wanted him to pick Haskins. That would have been a disaster. So he didn't, and he went with his gut and his guy, and I think he got it right.
Chatting with Sal Licata here on One. Sal, flipping it over to the baseball offseason, a very slow-moving one at that. Mets signed James McCann. Mets fans basically get all their wishes answered in 2020 despite a difficult year. Steve Cohen becomes the new owner of their baseball team. But admittedly, a slow-moving market. Trevor Bauer is still out there. George Springer is still out there. Talks about getting both. Maybe you get one or the other. As a Mets fan, what's your ultimatum for a successful offseason? And is it one or is it both?
I think it's probably George Springer, Emmanuel. For me, that's what I've been saying all along. Now, some of the numbers that have gone out there, you know, Springer wants 150. And they didn't say the years, but maybe you're thinking 5 years minimum. But let's say 150 million, and the Mets said 120 million. That's pretty significant difference right there. I do think George Springer, though, is the key to the Mets offseason. It's tricky to say one guy is going to make the offseason a success or a complete bust because there are many ways to do it. Let's say they don't get George Springer. They can figure out, you know, they could sign Ozuna, let's say, and put him in left field and figure out how they're going to go about it with center field. Maybe they could trade for Kiermaier from the Rays. There are other ways to do it to improve the ball club, and then they could go elsewhere and sign, let's say, LeMahieu, or, you know, make a trade for Arenado or Lindor. But the Met fan is so excited with Steve Cohen that I feel like they want Springer and Bauer and Lindor or Arenado and some bullpen help. I think they need bullpen help, which I think they'll get, whether it is Hendricks or Hand. I think they need that. I think they need another starter, not named Trevor Bauer. I would not go into the category that Bauer is going to be in as far as the finances go and spend 200 million or whatever it is, 30, 40 million a year on Trevor Bauer. I don't think they need that. You have one ace, you don't need two. But you could use an arm to lengthen out that starting rotation, which I think they'll get. I think they'll get a couple of bullpen arms. I think they'll get another arm to add to the depth of an already solid rotation. That's why I look at Springer as the guy. They don't have a center fielder. And realistically, where's the other good option? Brandon Nimmo is an okay player. He's not a real center fielder. Even Kiermaier, let's say they could get Kiermaier from the Rays. He's a great, great defensive center fielder. He's not the offensive player that George Springer is. He doesn't have that resume. So Springer, to me, is the perfect fit because he's a legit defensive center fielder. He's, from the Northeast in Connecticut. He's experienced in the postseason. He's had success. He's proven in the postseason. I think Springer would be the perfect fit. And I think the key to the offseason would be to sign him. And I do think they are going to get him. If they lose him, is it a complete failure? They'll make up for it, I think. But I think he's the key to having a very successful offseason.
Emmanuel asked about the Mets, so I'll flip it over to the Yankees here. And it's obviously a different conversation with the Yankees. They're just talking about really the main thing being bringing back DJ LeMahieu. So I'll ask kind of a similar question to what Emmanuel asked. What do you think the Yankees need to do this offseason, whether it's just bringing people back or maybe going out, getting some assets to make their fans feel good that they can maybe make up ground between them and the rest of the league? Obviously, they're close to winning a championship, but what do you think they need to do for their fans to feel really good about their title chances heading into 2021?
Yeah, Jimmy, I think it's about bringing back LeMahieu. Now, you talked about trying to improve. Before you can improve, you have to at least be the same, right? They can't improve their ball club if they lose DJ LeMahieu. You can maybe change the look of it. Let's say they lose LeMahieu and then they go out there and make a trade for Francisco Lindor and put him at short and then move Gleyber Torres to second base and they can fill out their infield like that. Wouldn't be a bad consolation prize, but the Yankees need DJ LeMahieu. That is, I mean, if they don't bring him back, it's a complete failure. He is so different from everybody else in their lineup. He is their MVP. He is their best hitter. He's an all-around great player, defensively, offensively. The Yankees need more of DJ LeMahieu. Now, those guys are hard to find, but at least they need players that are closer to LeMahieu as opposed to guys that are closer to Stanton and Judge and Voit and Sanchez, who are all or nothing hitters. They have too many of those guys. So bare minimum, and the Yankees aren't dealing with a lot of resources here, at least financially, where they don't want to go over the tax threshold. They already have mega contracts with Garrett Cole and Giancarlo Stanton. They're not going to overextend for LeMahieu as bad as they want him back. See, LeMahieu's in a weird spot because he wants to be with the Yankees, but he also wants what's best for him. And if the Dodgers are going to go out there and give him the best contract, the Dodgers at least can bring somewhat what the Yankees bring. They have that cachet. They're World Series champions. They're going to go out there and compete again for a World Series title. So that would be the team that would worry me if I'm the Yankees. But they have to bring LeMahieu back. Starts with that. And then what they need to do is get creative in dealing from the resources that they do have, which if you're not going to go out there and spend on players, there's another way to acquire players, and that's via trade. And they have prospects, so they're going to have to part with those prospects, whether that is in Duhar, Florial, whoever, Clint Frazier potentially. And I know he's even more than prospects. Obviously, they have lower level prospects that aren't household names. The only guy I wouldn't be looking to give up is Davey Garcia. I think he's, a young arm that you want to keep a part of that rotation. But there are other guys. The Reds, Luis Castillo is a guy who I would target if I'm the Yankees. Go out there and see what the Reds want to be able to get him. Try to take advantage of some teams that are selling off some of these players and want prospects. The Yankees have that. That's something I'd be looking to do in addition to bringing DJ LeMahieu back.
Sal, you mentioned Garrett Cole, and I think it's interesting because when the Yankees signed Cole, it was almost seen as the cherry on top, the finishing touch on a championship roster. But if the season started tomorrow, I don't like doing that, but it's the nature of where we are in the offseason. Garrett Cole's your ace, and then you're dealing with Montgomery, Herman maybe. You're going to Davey Garcia, Michael King. Are you concerned at all about this Yankee rotation picture?
Yeah, a little bit, but I still don't think that that's their issue. Now that they have Garrett Cole, they have the hardest part to find, which is that legit ace, right? So you have that, and then you kind of piece everybody in behind it. Now, it's going to be a young rotation, Emmanuel. As you mentioned, a lot of the guys there. I like Garcia. I like Montgomery. I like Michael King. Herman, who knows what's going to happen when he comes back, but at least he's had success here. You have to figure out, what he's going to be when he comes back from dealing with all the issues that he's dealt with. They have some young arms. I would like to see them add one more veteran behind Garrett Cole. And, is that bringing back Tanaka? I don't know. I love Tanaka. I think it's kind of over, though, with the Yankees and him. He is what he is. He disappointed in the postseason with the start against Cleveland. So that would, not that one start alone would concern me, but just I feel like we've gotten to a point where, from the Yankees' perspective, Tanaka has been in decline kind of since they brought him up. Would Tanaka help other teams in Major League Baseball? Yeah, I think he could be an upgrade in a rotation if he chooses to play for another team, if not go back to Japan. But I do think the Yankees need a veteran, a solid guy behind Garrett Cole, and then have those young guys fill in. They don't need Trevor Bauer, but they could use a guy. And I even like the guy like Luis Castillo, as I mentioned, a guy who dominated with the Reds, a young pitcher, maybe not that veteran presence you're looking for, But I think the Yankees should take a flyer on one of the veteran arms that are out there, whether they can go trade for one or sign one. They probably need that in the rotation. I don't think that's their biggest issue. Their biggest issue is not carrying over what is a usually dominant regular season offense into the postseason. And that needs to be fixed by bringing in guys who put the ball in play.
He's Sal Licata, SNY, WFAN, brand new New York Post Knicks podcast. You can follow him on Twitter at Sal_Licata. Sal, really appreciate a few minutes and Happy New Year.
Thanks, guys. Happy New Year, Emmanuel and Jimmy. I appreciate you having me on. Good luck with the show.
WFUV is the flagship station of Fordham Athletics. Keep it locked right here on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org to catch every Fordham basketball game this year. We'll take you through an extraordinary season with live play-by-play and in-depth pregame and postgame analysis. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. 12:22 in the morning on January 3rd. Jimmy Sullivan, Alex Woles with you, taking you up until 2 a.m. on 90.7 FM, Facebook, and YouTube. Just heard from Sal Licata from SNY and WFAN, and now time to talk a little basketball. And really interesting time, Alex, right now in New York basketball specifically. You've got obviously the Brooklyn Nets who feel like they can contend for a championship this year. You've got the New York Knicks who are just trying to contend for anything really right now, a playoff spot, whatever that may be, they'll take it. And Alex, I'm actually going to start with the Knicks here.
All right.
Because it's really interesting to look at their start to the season. They're 2-3. They've got wins over the Bucks and the Cavaliers, and they currently sit under 500. But I don't know how you feel about this, but a lot to be optimistic about for Knicks fans. Julius Randle playing well, RJ Barrett playing well. There's a lot you can feel good about right now if you're a Knicks fan, even if the results maybe lag a bit behind.
I love what the Knicks did this offseason because it would have been a very Knicks move to go out and get those big names like a Russell Westbrook and throw around a lot of money without really a lot of confidence. But they didn't do that. They showed a lot of temperance and they really made a smart decision in bringing in some valuable pieces, Austin Rivers and the like, without really blowing the bank open and really saving up when the big free agents roll around. And what you're seeing to start the season is a very young, aggressive, and I think pretty talented Knicks team. Julius Randle, obviously the standout of that, and I've been a big fan of him, actually, ever since they traded him to New York in the first place. He's a double-double machine, and he's doing it again this year, also passing the ball a lot better as well. So you take that, you take a lot of young guys, RJ Barrett, obviously improving, still steps to go, but improving, along with the great attitude of head coach Tom Thibodeau, and I think you're looking at a Knicks team that, look, we talked about this a little bit in the open, playoffs or not, that's not the point, but they're a lot more competitive and a lot more solidified than a lot of the older Knicks teams and organizations.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the offseason because we have not typically associated the New York Knicks with a lot of restraint.
Mhm.
And yet here we are. And, Julius Randle off to a great start, had the triple double the other night. He's averaging 23 points, 10 rebounds, 7 assists. That'll play. RJ Barrett, 15 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists. And it's an offense that right now, no Obi Toppin, no Emmanuel Quickly. And we're not even really seeing what the young guys can do because we haven't seen all three of them, being Barrett, Quickly, and Toppin together in a while. And yet, here's a team that's competitive. And I think that does go back to Tom Thibodeau. And, you see it every time the Knicks play, right? The energy, the emotion, the Thibodeau, I feel like, calls at least one angry timeout a game. And that's kind of what the Knicks need right now. And, look, he's, I think, been a pretty strong leader. They're playing those guys a lot of minutes, which is a little nerve-wracking. And I think that's kind of what we thought would happen here. I mean, you got RJ Barrett averaging 37 minutes a game. Is that sustainable? I don't know. But that's what Tom Thibodeau does. That's what the situation is going to be. But I do think you have to give him a lot of credit for how this team has started this season.
Yeah, and in general, you have a good meshing, I think, between some experienced veterans and also some young guys and kind of learning from each other. And I think, look, it's interesting, like you mentioned, to see how this team is going to change when Toppin and when Quickly enter the fold. Because I think we both expect, at least I do, that they're going to be pretty substantial pieces of this team, particularly for Toppin, knowing that we have some experience with him in the A10. And that when those guys come, I think you really have to expect this Knicks team to have a lot of power and a lot of action from some younger guys. And they're going to be able to keep up with the rest of the league while balancing that with some great veteran leadership as well. And I think those are the two things that you need to be a successful NBA team, is some young talent that you can develop, which hopefully Tom Thibodeau is able to do, and also some leaders that can keep the team in check when things get tough, because you know that the Knicks are going to face those situations as well.
Yeah, and it's, you talk about Julius Randle. I mean, there's been a buy-in from him, and we were talking before the season about what is the Knicks' most productive use of this year, because who knows how good they're going to be? Who knows how much it matters, honestly? And, we're sitting here, and Julius Randle has been a revelation as a point forward. They're using him in the right way, I think, and he's really emerged. Now, is he going to put up these numbers all season? Probably not, and that's fine. The Knicks don't need him to. What's much more important to me with this season, it's not about the playoffs. It's not about the record, as antithetical as that may seem to the entire point of sports, basically. It's not about those things with the Knicks this year. To me, it is about the development of the young players, how comfortable they are in this system, and how much they can progress between now and the end of the year. And I think if those things happen, even if the Knicks don't make the playoffs, even if they finish, with wins somewhere in the 20s, I still think you're looking at that and saying, you know what, that's a successful season. And I think if they maybe get a few more wins, that can be gravy, basically. But the biggest thing for the Knicks right now is the development side.
I completely agree. I think I see this year as pretty much a stepping stone for the Knicks to ultimately where they want to be. Because, look, I mean, even if the Knicks were to make the playoffs this year, I know that could be a check mark in the box, but you're not going to win a first round series. I think we all know that against the top teams of the East. But what you can see is a team that gets playoff experience potentially, is a team that gets experience playing in meaningful games down the stretch, and a team that improves week after week. And I think as a fan or as an organization, that's all you can really hope for compared to what the Knicks have been doing the last few years. Tanking, trying to get the top pick, haven't ultimately gotten that top pick, but gotten key players that you can ultimately say, hey, these are young guys we're really confident about, and RJ Barrett and hopefully in Toppin and Quickly as well. There's still some question marks. I think Kevin Knox, Mitchell Robinson, those certainly are pieces that you need to really figure out. But ultimately, what you're seeing is not a team that's tanking. You're not going to see a team that's just hitting the brakes and not really caring about this season. You're going to see a team that competes, that fights every game, and like you said, whatever the outcome of that, if it's the playoffs or if it's nowhere near it, that's what you want to see, the development, the competitiveness that's been sorely lacking the past few years.
Right now, if the season ended today, and this is a very toxic thing we do, but if the season ended today, the Knicks would be out of the playoffs. So just missed. So did your
Well,
Miami Heat, as
so
a
with the
matter of
Nuggets,
fact.
I mean, I
Yes.
think that's actually one of the more interesting things about this season. I mean, to kind of transition is just how all over the place these records are in terms of who's good and who's not. And the Knicks are one of those right in the middle of the pack teams, and I think that's pretty accurate to where they're going to be. But the rest of the NBA is a muddled mess right now.
Yeah, I mean, until a couple nights ago, the best team in the league was the Orlando Magic, and we're not we're not expecting them to win it
don't think
all.
so?
I don't
No?
think. No, you've got a four-way tie at the top of the East right now. It's Philadelphia, Indiana, Atlanta, and Orlando. Go figure. Out west, best team in the West and best team in the NBA right now is the Phoenix Suns. So it's early. It's early, but this is this is what we're going to be dealing with all season long. I was also reminded of the weirdness of this season when I was watching the Knicks the other night on New Year's Eve, and they were playing the Toronto Raptors in Tampa, in the Lightning Arena, and I said, "This is weird."
I will say I love Toronto's court though in Tampa. I think it's a
Yes.
major upgrade. That's probably the only positive, but I'll throw
I
that.
don't know. I liked their court like in Canada. Like I think all that stuff's fine with them. Like their uniforms, I feel like they've also really upgraded in the last few years.
Yes.
Like the old like dinosaur thing was kind of weird.
See, I like the purple. You didn't like the purple dinosaur?
I didn't love the
Oh,
purple.
man.
I like what they're doing better now. I'm weird with the uniforms because I didn't like the purple, but like every time the Memphis Grizzlies wear the green throwbacks, sign me up.
Those are nice. I think it's for me because I have fond memories of Vince Carter 2000 dunk contest. That's just number one in my mind.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. I mean, it's him in that uniform. That was an iconic performance, so I cannot blame you for that at all. But Knicks are treading water in the East. Let's move over to the Brooklyn Nets. They've had an interesting week. I think that's one way to put it. They have lost Spencer Dinwiddie for the season, which is a big loss for them, a key piece in their starting lineup, probably the best non-Big Three player that they have. And then, in the wake of that, Brooklyn's lost a couple of games here. They wound up losing on Friday night to the Hawks. That was the back end of a doubleheader, if you will, in the NBA this year. Again, weird to use that terminology with basketball. But they lose to Atlanta. They lose to the Grizzlies, largely without Ja Morant. That was a rest night for KD and Kyrie. And they lost to the Charlotte Hornets this week, 1-3, since we talked last on Saturday about how good the Nets were. We still think the Nets are going to be really good. But Alex, how concerned are you with the way that they have played this week as they tumble a bit back down to 500 at 3-3?
For me, the concern is not about this week. It's about actually Spencer Dinwiddie. I think that's a big concern because there was a point you actually brought up about a week ago now about the number one key for the Nets to be successful this year is staying healthy. Because what we saw in that first game and the second game as well against the Celtics is a Nets team that was very deep. They have a roster that second unit, I mean, between you're seeing Karis LeVert, Spencer Dinwiddie, you're seeing Joe Harris, Jared Allen, all these guys that are really, really talented and could start on a lot of NBA rosters. You lose one of those pieces, and it's almost like losing a starting player. I think it's that significant. And Spencer Dinwiddie, we all know how impressive he is before Kyrie and KD were there. He's a very talented player and a very important part of this team. So if you lose him for what seems like a significant amount of time with the ACL injury, I mean, I'm not sure if it's going to be the whole year. He might come around the playoffs, but it's going to be a significant part of it. You're losing a very major piece of this team. As for this week in particular, I'm not overly concerned about it because, like we said, it's early. The NBA season in general is a bit of a mess right now in terms of records. You're going to see a lot of guys resting. You're going to see a lot of lopsided score lines. And they lost to some good teams. I think Atlanta is actually a team that you really got to watch out for in the East because they're going to be very impressive. And I don't think the Nets should be overly concerned, sitting around 500 now. But look, what we saw at the first two games of the season is what we needed to see. And that's that the Kyrie-Kevin Durant experiment has the potential to work out really well, and that Steve Nash is a coach that can successfully lead this team. Those were my two big things coming into the season. I wasn't as concerned about them as others, and they've worked out to start. The rest of it, I think, will work itself out. But those two key pillars, they seem to have satisfied pretty well.
Yeah, and you don't rule out a Spencer Dinwiddie return. Neither is Spencer Dinwiddie, but they probably shouldn't count on that happening. No. That's it's doubtful that he's going to be back. But it's interesting also, you look at the Nets, the thing that concerns me but with what I've seen is some of the defensive issues that they're having. Like, they're giving up a lot of open looks. John Collins, by the way, last night on Friday night, threw down an unbelievable dunk in that game towards the end. It was incredible, and it was kind of the icing on the cake, if you will, for the Nets. But I will say that it's interesting because, you give up 141 to the Hawks and you win that game, but still, you give up 116 to Memphis in OT. That's not as concerning. And another big output for Atlanta last night. And in addition to the health, this is a team that's still figuring it out defensively. Will they be better defensively at the end of the season? Yes. But I do think it's something that they need to iron out. And it's not as much of a concern for me because I think they will, but it is something that they very much need to address right now.
Well, I know we're speaking specifically about the Knicks here, but this is not a a Nets problem specifically on defense, because this is an NBA problem right now. There is not any sense of defense going on right now anywhere across the NBA. The Nets just happen to be a part of that. It seems like there's been just a love of scoring to start the season. I mean, you're seeing 140 to 110 games. You're seeing 100-point games in the third quarter. So I don't think it's specifically a Nets problem. And knowing Steve Nash, I think he's going to draw up a really good offense, especially with Mike D'Antoni. I think you're going to see some good stuff offensively. There's going to be some questions defensively, but I actually think that's a lot of how the NBA operates today. It's just a lot of high-scoring games. If you can put the most points in the basket, you're going to have success, and I think the Nets are going to be able to do that.
And I think that leads well into the final point I want to talk about with the NBA here. And that is that we can almost start calling it the National Blowout Association with the way some of these games are going. So this caught my eye the other day from ESPN Stats and Info. And I will admit I have not run the numbers in the last couple of days to update this, but this was on Wednesday. They tweeted this out. NBA teams so far this year averaging a winning margin of 12.98 points per game. Third largest average margin in NBA history through 54 league games, and the largest since 1971-72. And back then, to be honest, there was not nearly as much parity as there is in the league now because there weren't nearly as many teams. That's why you had, the Celtics and Lakers ripping off huge streaks of winning titles. But Alex, I find this fascinating because we were talking about the short off season and we were thinking, okay, well, what's going to be the ramifications of that? And we're saying, well, maybe there'll be more injuries or whatever the case may be. I don't know how many people were bringing up the idea that there were going to be so many blowouts, but it feels like every night there are multiple games decided by 20 and 30 and sometimes even more points.
The thing about it, there's not really a formula to it either, because it just seems like it's almost random in terms of what's happening. I mean, I'll take my Miami Heat as an example. They get blown out by 50 to the Bucks. They win by 20 the next day. How do you explain that? You really can't. So I think you're just seeing teams just taking days off when they choose in these back-to-back scenarios where you say, hey, I beat a team once. I'm not going to beat them again if we play 2 NBA games back-to-back. That's just not going to happen. So they're kind of picking and choosing what games to take off. But I do think in a broader sense, look at who the top teams are right now in the NBA. It's a lot of those teams that were fringe bubble teams last year that are very talented but didn't have to go through that entire exhaustion of the NBA bubble. You're seeing the likes of Atlanta, the likes of Phoenix, who, yes, they bolstered up and they're significantly better, but they also had some game experience, so they're not dealing with the rust of some teams like the Warriors, for example, but they also aren't dealing with the exhaustion of a team like the Miami Heat or the Lakers. I think you're going to see in the beginning of the season teams like that, talented ones in that middle ground, really make some quick strides. Ultimately, it will probably all level itself out as, teams start really getting into the bulk of the season. That's not even a word, but the bulk of the season, and ultimately kind of start getting back to normal. But I think you're going to see at the beginning a bit of a lopsided nature in terms of who's competing and who's not.
Hey, we're just making up words here on one-on-one.
I mean, it's
12:40 in the morning. I can't blame you. But I will say it is interesting because you talk about the Heat and the Bucks. The Bucks have just been blown out by 20 by the Knicks.
There you go. Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. And yet here we are 2 nights later, and the game is so bad that it's getting the red zone treatment basically on TNT, where they're not even showing it.
I was fine with that. I'll just say, as a fan.
I was more than I was. Yes, absolutely.
More of that is good.
This is like League Pass for free. It was great. But it's funny because the Lakers and the Heat obviously had the shortest offseason because they played in the finals. Everybody else got a bit of a head start. I mean, you're seeing that with Miami. They're very up and down. The Lakers have been good, but the Lakers are good, and that's to be expected. Not that the Heat aren't, but the Lakers are just so talented. And no matter what you do, like LeBron and Anthony Davis, we're going to be ready to go. But it is odd, and I don't know if it's a quality of play concern, because you also have to remember, like, there are some teams who are playing well right now, like the Atlanta Hawks, who had last played on March 11th and had over 9 months between games, basically. I don't know if it's a quality of play thing. Some nights, you shoot better than others. I think that's probably part of it. I don't know. But we all knew coming into this, like, this season is weird. Everyone knows that, right? We're playing in a pandemic. Most places don't have fans. Shortest off season ever. List goes on and on. But one of the things that struck me about the bubble was how pleasantly surprised I think everyone was with the quality of play. Like, it was really good. Like, those games, the first week the NBA came back, the first week of games was tremendous. Like, you had so many close games. And I wonder if the quality of play isn't taking a bit of a hit here just because there isn't a bubble. There's travel. There's, back-to-backs. I mean, there's less travel than there would be, but there's still a lot of travel. And, you have basically a full season, and guys are still revving up in a large sense, which would happen regularly, but I think even more so now because there was so little time between when the bubble ended and when this season started. So I wonder if that's not also a part of it, that the shorter off season is probably hurting the quality of play, at least for some of these teams.
We were spoiled in the bubble. We saw so many good teams, so many good games. I think part of it, too, we're just returning to normal again. There's a lot of teams in the NBA that just aren't very good, and I think we're starting to see that. We got spoiled.
Yeah, we did. Hey, it's okay. Because I think that was the exact thing we needed at that time in the summer, and that's not realistic now because you can't ask people to do that again. But that's where the NBA kind of is right now, and we'll monitor that as the season goes along. A lot of storylines for the Knicks, the Nets, and the league. Coming up next, we'll have some more headlines with Kayla Wenzel. A lot going on in the world of sports. Kayla will break it all down with us after this break. We'll be right back on One on One.
Check out all of our latest podcasts on WFUVsports.org or wherever you get your shows, including NFL Friday, Nosebleeds, Pick and Pod, 5 on 3, College Gridiron, and FUV FC. Also, our newest edition, Off the Air, diving into the station's legacy with its most prominent alumni. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Welcome back. We are entering our final hour here on One on One. I'm Kayla Wenzel, joining Alex Walls and Jimmy Sullivan. And guys, 2020 just could not end without having a few more historic milestones for us. So the Red Sox hire Bianca Smith as a minor league coach for them, making her the first Black woman to coach any MLB team in history. Additionally, Becky Hammon made her coaching debut in the second quarter of the Spurs versus Lakers game this past week when head coach Greg Popovich was ejected. So these are super exciting accomplishments, having two women in charge of more and more games, and we've seen that happening more all 2020. So Alex, my question to you is, do you think that this is a trend that's going to continue into 2021? Was 2020 an anomaly? And then what league do you think women have the most opportunity in?
That's pretty interesting to think about. But I think in general, 2020 has been a very impressive year in terms of a lot of the strides we've seen that have been made for women in sports. I think particularly the first one that we all remember was Kim Ang getting hired as general manager of the Marlins. That was obviously so significant for someone, an Asian American, also a woman, to take that position of power. Now we're seeing Bianca Smith with the Red Sox. We've seen other women too in the previous years take over as hitting coaches and assistant coaches, and it seems like there's those stepping stones that ultimately are going to bring us to potentially a head coach and potentially like a general manager, like we saw with Kim Ang. And I think those type of strides are really great to see, and I think it's something that's appreciated because you think about any workplace, and sports is no exception to this. You want a diversity of thought and a diversity of ideas. And baseball is no exception to that because you think you have a softball player here in Bianca Smith who's going to get a different perspective than a baseball player that can be really beneficial, where you think that's a different style of play, that's a different game. It's somebody who's dealt with different challenges coming up in the sport. And that's something that you have to appreciate when you get into these type of positions of power and leaders and you're making these decisions. The more you have to work with, the more relatable your organization is, the more successful it's going to be. And I think that's a really, really great stride to see. And as for Becky Hammon, I think that's really where I think a lot of those strides are going to be made. I think she's going to be the first female head coach in the NBA. I really do believe that because everything that Greg Popovich has been saying, we know his retirement is near, we know it's approaching, and we know that she is almost like his right-hand woman. I think there's only a matter of time until she really gets that opportunity to head coach in the NBA because she deserves it. She's obviously qualified and she's very talented. She led the team to a summer league title. She knows what she's doing and she's a terrific coach. And I think when she gets that opportunity, you're really going to see that barrier be broken down in that league and in sports.
Yeah, and it's bouncing off of your point, Alex. I think with Hammond, what we've seen over the past few years is the fact that they really trust her with a lot of stuff in San Antonio. She is, the de facto top assistant to Popovich, even though I don't think he really delineates that stuff in title. But they hired her a few years ago, and Greg Popovich has specifically said, this is not because she's a woman. This is not because we want to make history. This is because we think she could be really good. And we've seen that. I mean, you don't stay in that job next to Greg Popovich if you're not good. And she's done that. And whether it's with the Spurs or somewhere else, she's going to be a head coach someday. We don't know exactly when. I would bet on it being sooner rather than later. And one of the other things that I've also seen is that, certain idiots on the internet have said oh, well, men respect a woman. Well, yeah, they do. People all around the NBA, really respect Becky Hammon. I was listening to Kyrie Irving the other day, and he was talking about how much he respects her. He's never played for her. But still, you have that level of respect because you've seen what she's able to do. So I think that's cool. I think the Bianca Smith stuff is super cool in baseball because I think baseball has maybe not done a good enough job, particularly with, engaging, non-white, people in the sport, particularly in the U.S. And I think they need to do a much better job with that. I think they've tried, but I don't think it's gone far enough. And, it's a good hire. And, you guys said, she's a softball player, so she can, obviously, I think, analyze hitting the same way that, a male coach would, because I think it's a lot of the same ideas. So I think it's super cool. And shows you 2020 wasn't all bad, I suppose. But yeah, I think it's really cool to see both of those things happen this week.
Yeah, I definitely speak as a woman. I love to see this. I'm super excited about it. As someone who is trying to pursue a career in sports, it's something that's not easy. The field is definitely male dominated. And so that's definitely something that I've already faced challenges with, and I'm only in college. So I give these women such credit for just being so relentless in their pursuit of their dreams. And I'm so excited that they are successful. I hope to see them be more successful. I really want to see Becky Hammon do more than just coach the one game. But I do think that she definitely has opportunities to be a head coach somewhere. And to your point, Jimmy, about how people on the internet were saying that maybe men wouldn't respect her. Look at the Spurs team. They did respect her when she took over. There was no fanfare about it. She coached. They played well. that's what it is. So I think that that's super exciting, and I love to see that. I'm excited about the MLB, especially with the hiring of Kim Ng and now Bianca Smith. I think that those are really they're going to bring different perspectives, like you said, Alex, and they're just going to bring a whole new world and new eyes to the sport, and it's going to really open a lot of opportunities.
Did you, before we move on here, did you guys see what Greg Popovich said about how when he got ejected, what wound up happening? He gets tossed, as he every so often does, and they toss him, and he said literally, and they went back and showed the tape, this is what happened. He was walking off the floor, he pointed to Becky Hammon and said, "You do it." I mean, that's the level of trust they have, where it wasn't this premeditated thing. It was like, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that. It was like, nah, just go, coach, just go do it. So I think that's really good to see too.
Yeah, and I love that because it's more about her qualifications and her credentials. It wasn't like, oh, I'll be the first one to have a woman coach my team. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't any like political forethought thing. It was, she's the most qualified. She's going to coach the team. There's no questions about it. So I do really love that.
Well, when you talk about Becky Hammon quickly here, you run through her as a WNBA player. She's a 6-time All-Star. She was in the league for 15 years. She's been incredibly successful at that level. So I think, look, whether you're successful in the WNBA or the NBA, you still need to be a great basketball player in your respective league. You need to know how to read the floor, shoot the basketball, know how to run plays, the same skills that you need as a coach. It's no different. And that doesn't mean that every player transfers to be a good coach. And Pau Gasol actually talked about this, the Laker legend. He talked about how it's not about her being a great coach, her being a bad coach, her being a female. It's about she can coach basketball. She knows basketball. And at the end of the day, that language doesn't need any sort of gender, it doesn't need any race. And that's what it matters in basketball and in any other sport.
No, that's very well said, Alex. Moving to baseball, the Mets and the Yankees have some big decisions to make, guys, for their offseason. So both the Mets and the Blue Jays have deep pockets, and they have their eyes set on Astros center fielder and righty slugger George Springer. Now, Springer's not close to a decision yet, but he is seeking upwards of $150 million. The Bronx Bombers also have some decisions to make regarding Masahiro Tanaka. Tanaka has expressed that he will only play for the Yankees or he will go back to Japan. So I think Tanaka would be an affordable and reliable options for the Yankees, who could use some continuity in their pitching staff. So Jimmy, do you think Springer is worth the $150 million? And what do you think about Tanaka and the Yankees?
Starting with Springer, it's really interesting. He wants $150 million. The Mets have started at a lower number. He will probably not get $150 million. Like, he can get close to that. But him setting the price that high, I don't think is necessarily indicative of him actually securing that back. That being said, I think he's a perfect fit for the Mets. They need an outfielder, and you have Brandon Nimmo out there in center, who's not a pure center fielder. George Springer is, and he can be, at least for the first couple of years of that deal. And I think that would be a really good fit. I would rather them go out, throw that money at Springer, than maybe go out and say get a Bauer, because I think that's a better fit for the Mets right now. And you add George Springer to that lineup, and you take him and you look at the other prized offseason acquisition for the Mets and James McCann. If you add George Springer to the Mets lineup, James McCann's sitting 8th or 9th. And that's how good the Mets lineup could be with that one added piece. So I think he's a great fit for the Mets. I think the Blue Jays are also willing to give him that money, and I also think they want to drive up the price. I think that's a big part of it as well. Would I be surprised if they ultimately got Springer? No, I wouldn't. But I do think that the price gouging on their part is actually part of it, and I think it's smart for them. Moving over to Tanaka, I think the Yankees have to do something about this rotation, whether it's Tanaka, whether it's Jake Odorizzi, whether it's another 4th or 5th starter. And we ran a graphic on the show last week.
I'll play it again.
Yes, you pull it up, Alex. Where it was the Yankees rotation without James Paxton, who's their other free agent, and without Masahiro Tanaka. It's frightening. It's not good. You're giving starts to the likes of Michael King and Domingo Germán, who was good a couple of years ago, but had a suspension for all of last year and hasn't pitched in a big league game in a while. You don't want to do that. You do not want to go into 2021 with that much on the shoulders of people who have not really held those roles in the rotation before. Because right now you're looking at Garrett Cole and way down from there. So you need to go out and get somebody, whether it's Tanaka or somebody else. I don't know. I am actually of the mind that Tanaka is probably going to go back to Japan because I think I'm speculating here, obviously, but I think that makes a lot of sense for him. He was really good over there. They love him and they'd love to have him back. So I would not be surprised at all to see him do that. But it's for the Yankees. I don't think it's specifically about Tanaka. I just think it's about specifically doing something about that rotation. Like that is the biggest concern for me for the Yankees right now. And I think that's even more of a concern to me than whether or not they bring back DJ LeMahieu, which is another thing the Yankees fans are really up in arms about.
Yeah, I think ultimately the Yankees can't get to where they want to go without a solid rotation, and I think Paxton's a big part of that, and so is Tanaka, particularly in the postseason. I mean, his ERA in general is hovering around 3. It's very good. Drops even more in the ALDS, drops below 2 in his only games in the ALCS. He's been brilliant in the playoffs, and that's ultimately where the Yankees have faltered every year, is in the playoffs. And I think it's interesting when you compare him to DJ LeMahieu because those are your two clutch guys, to be quite honest with you. You have your clutch pitcher when you need in a big spot. You've got the hitter who gets a hit for you every time. So it's a tough equation to balance, but I think Tanaka is a key part of it. I mean, he's 32 years old now. I think the contract situation is interesting to consider, the type of deal that they give him. But look, where the Yankees are right now in their window, I think you need to really make an effort to get Tanaka because, like you said, Jimmy, like that graphic showed, it's a bullpen that's going to struggle without him. And look, your window here is going to close soon. There's a couple more years here where the Yankees are going to have the big contracts and the big swingers that they have right now. And I think you need to really, like we talked about with the Padres, you need to do everything you can to double down and get the guys you need in order to make that run at the World Series. And I'm not saying if they don't have Tanaka, they can't make a run because obviously he's not that crucial, but he is a very important part of this piece that can give you that extra boost that I think you need. And for the Mets and for Springer, I actually have the same opinion you do, Jimmy, about price gouging because I think that's really what a lot of this is. I'm of the same vein as you that I don't think 150 million, 200 million are going to be thrown around at these guys, but the Mets are probably the only team in the league that can pay that. And if they're involved, why wouldn't you, if you're a Springer or Bauer, say, I want the biggest contract I can get because the Mets, I'm not going to call them desperate, but they have the money to get these guys. In a market that's dying at this current moment when there's not a lot of teams that are going to be willing to spend that, if the Mets are, might as well go out and ask for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I mean, Mets fans are waiting for that big splash, you know, who is the big player that Steve Cohen's going to get? They got McMahon, but they are really looking for something bigger here. And I think that Springer would fulfill that. I think he would be great on the team, but I do think that the 150 million is overrated for him. And I'm not sure that the Mets should pay that. I mean, he's 31, so I don't know how long. He probably wants like 5 years, 6 years, maybe. He's going to start to go downhill. He's going to decline a little bit. I'm not sure necessarily that is worth the $150 million. But I know that the Mets would be one of the only ones willing to pay that. And I think that playing in New York is just better than playing in Toronto. I mean, if he was willing to go down a little bit on his price, I think that there's a lot of intangibles that could bring Springer to the Mets over just the money.
Yeah, and I think you don't want to pay that kind of money. I think if you have to, so be it. And it's interesting, you look at the 5 years, and I think you brought up a really good point, which is that, you know, if you sign him for 5 years and 150, you're paying the most for like the first 3 years of that deal. And it's the same logic when guys get signed for 8 years or 10 years or 12 years. Yeah, the Dodgers are paying Mookie Betts for the next 12 years, yes, but they realize at some point like there will be a attrition in his abilities to an extent. It might not be for a while because he's really good and he's really young, but you're not paying for all 12 years. You're paying for like 8 to 10 good years, and then the last couple of years of that contract, you'll figure it out. I think it's the same deal with Springer, and I think the Mets at the end of the day ultimately are willing to go places that I don't think any other team is going to go, with the exception of Toronto. And we've also, you know, seen that Toronto may be in on LeMahieu possibly for the Yankees as well. I feel okay if I'm a Mets fan right now. I mean, they went out, got James McCann strictly for the purposes that they could spend more money that way. That if they went out and signed McCann and not Real Muto, that they could save some money and then use that to go get other people. So look, I think the Mets are doing a good job with the front office. I think they've hired a lot of the right people, and I trust them. And for the for the first time in my life, I trust the New York Mets front office. So happy 2021.
Well, what was that championship timeline, Jimmy? It was 3 to 5 years. That's what
Yes.
Steve Cohen told you. So if you're signing George Springer to a 5-6 year contract, that's what you asked for right there. That's what you said you're going to do. So even if it costs $150 million, that's the guy that fits right in, I think, to your timeline. And so does Bauer, but it costs a little bit more. I think Springer is that guy that you got to go to if you're true to your word about that timeline.
Steve Cohen's great. Love Steve Cohen. He has all of the Mets Twitter instincts, but also $15 billion, which is good.
So you're saying the second part not as important as the first? Is that first part, the Twitter?
Oh, he's hilarious on Twitter. I don't know if you guys follow him, but he's very funny. And he just he tweeted out the other day. He said, "I'm gonna call Jared Porter, the GM, and see what's up." Like just out of the blue. Who does that? That's terrific. But yeah, I feel good about the Mets' direction right now. Yeah, should they be judged on whether or not they get Springer? Yeah, maybe. But they got a good front office, good people in charge. This team is not a player away from winning a title next year, but they could help that case possibly the rest of this offseason. So we'll see where it winds up going. Kayla, we'll talk to you again before the show ends. Coming up next, we'll talk to Kazeem Famuyide of MSG AM. Talked a lot of Knicks stuff with him, and we will play that for you next. Come back on the other side. You're listening to One on One on 90.7 FM.
Be sure to check out all of our latest podcasts on WFUVSports.org or wherever you get your shows, including NFL Friday, Nosebleeds, Pick and Pod, 5 on 3, College Gridiron, and FUV FC. Also, our newest edition, Off the Air, diving into the station's legacy with its most prominent alumni. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics. It's WFUV and WFUV HD, New York. Listener-supported public media from Fordham, the Jesuit University of New York. Right here on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org. This is One on One, New York's longest-running sports call-in show on 90.7 FM, WFUV.org, and WFUVSports.org.
Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show, taking you up until 2 a.m. here on 90.7 FM, Facebook, and YouTube. Jimmy Sullivan, Alex Walls, now pleased to be joined by the co-host of MSG AM, Kazeem Famuyide. As we said, he co-hosts MSG AM from 8 to 9 in the morning alongside Monica McNutt. He's also the host of the Say Less podcast with Kaz and Loki. Kaz, thanks so much for being with us. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. It's New Year's almost here. Just home, cozy. 2 Knicks wins, so I'm in a better mood than usual. But things are good, man. How about yourself?
We're doing great. Thanks for being here. And first time in a while, I feel like I can say that. I want to talk about the New York Knicks. And they were really good. Their win over Cleveland, Julius Randle, a triple-double. Just off the jump, as you watched the Knicks to start this season, how impressed have you been with the way this team has come out of the gate under Tom Thibodeau?
Well, the most impressive thing about the Knicks, which any diehard, starving New York Knicks fan could attest to, is that even in the first preseason game, these guys play really hard. Like they don't give up on plays, they hustle on defense, even when the shots weren't falling, which is a major concern in the preseason. The rotations on defense were incredible. They're crisp. Tom Thibodeau is a no nonsense guy. If there's a guy who missed a rotation or somebody got an open shot or somebody just blew something on a back door or something, those quick timeouts are definitely starting to pay off early in the season. Those guys know that the better they play, the more they're going to stay on the court, and the leash is pretty quick. So off rip, one of my favorite things about this team is just the effort, man. Like, a lot of people will say that New York isn't built for a rebuild, especially the New York Knicks. And I kind of beg to differ. I think New York Knicks fans just want to see a team that goes and gets bloody knees and dives on the floor and ready to fight. Not the fake, like, oh, we're bringing the 90s back. Oh, let's be tough guys fight. But I mean, like, show fight when you play. Like, you're going to get punched. This is the NBA. Every team's going to make a run. Punch back and just see what happens. So outside of everything offensively, the defense is what I've been extremely happy to see in the effort, and that's all thanks to that coaching staff with Kenny Payne, Mike Woodson, and of course Tom Thibodeau.
That's exactly what I was going to ask about is Tom Thibodeau, because there was a lot of, I think, concern about how he would mesh with some of the younger guys on this team in terms of his history, but you knew you would get that effort that you kind of talked about right there. So what you've seen in the first 4 games so far, that effort that you talked about, is that script pretty much you think what's going to play out this season and what you expected, or you think there's some surprises in store for what we're going to see this year?
Well, they're the second youngest team, or I think the youngest team in the NBA right now. I don't know. It's either top 3 or top 2, whatever. They got youth. They got energy. They should be able to run and play hard and play defense and give effort at the very minimum. Okay. So I think that's definitely going to be a calling card of this team. And one of the best traits about having a good coach is knowing personnel and knowing what you got. They don't have a superstar. I mean, if you want to, Julius Randle is playing like a superstar right now, but granted, if he keeps this up all season, I will be the happiest Knick fan in the world. But I don't think anybody I don't think anybody that watches the game or watches the Knicks expects Julius Randle to drop triple doubles every night, So the effort's gonna have to be there, and that's gonna be their calling card of the team. They're gonna have to be a scrappy team. They're gonna have to win ugly. There's gonna be some 95-86 games like last night where nobody gets over 100 points and people are bricking shots, and that's what you want if you're a fan of the New York Knicks. It's not gonna be I mean, granted, there was that sort of aberration the past 2 games where the Knicks suddenly lead the league in 3-point field goal percentage. But the one thing you can always count on is effort and defense. Shots are going to fall. Shots are going to miss. It's a make or miss league, as you hear all the time, a million times around. But the one thing you could always control is your effort and the defense. So with that youth, that coaching staff, and everything else that they got going on, and just pride, like everybody's trying to little brother you in your own city. Everybody's trying to say like the Brooklyn Nets are the big show in town. Like, you got to have a little pride as well. These are all professional athletes, so I think they got that going for them. And the fact that I think a lot of people kind of slept on the Knicks and slept on the depth that they have, and like the sort of mix of young talent and veterans that have won at the big level and have had big expectations throughout their career. So I think that's going to be something that we could really count on to seeing from the Knicks all season.
Talking with Kazeem Famuyide, co-host of MSG AM here on One. Kaz, staying on the subject of the Knicks, and in the absence of Julius Randle, averaging a triple-double every night, which is great, but as you said, probably not going to happen. I think it's also worth noting that the Knicks are kind of banged up right now. No Obi Toppin, no Emmanuel Quickly for a lot of the early season games. Just how much do you think it'll also help when those guys come back, the 2 first-round draft picks the Knicks had in November? How much do you think that'll help this Knicks team to get that transfusion of energy from those guys when they come back into the lineup?
Well, I think it's 2 things, right? the reason why these two victories have felt really good for Knicks fans is because of exactly what you said. They haven't had a lot of depth. I think yesterday they only played 8 players, and that rotation was pretty tight. And that could be a double-edged sword. Some players play better knowing that they're going to play and they're not going to have the quick leash because the rotation is small. Other players might need that rest and might need that time to kind of sit down and relax. How that factors in with the rookies, Obi Toppin and Emmanuel Quickly. The one thing I really noticed about Emmanuel Quickly is that he plays with such pace. And the one thing that Alfred Payton has done really well throughout his Knicks career is always play with pace. He always pushes the ball. He always penetrates. He always makes great plays. He does everything you really want out of an NBA point guard. He just couldn't really shoot it. So obviously when you've seen him knocking down threes and getting buckets against the Milwaukee Bucks, they win in a rout because that's been the one missing piece as far as New York Knicks. I mean, they have talent. They have talent on the wings. They have talent on the post. They have talent at center. They just need a conductor to sort of swing this whole thing through. And the reason why Knicks fans have gotten such a wet appetite over Emmanuel Quickly is because we saw that. We saw him play like a point guard that watches NBA basketball in the 2020s. He's going to shoot. He's going to get floaters. He's going to run up and down. He's not going to walk the ball up. He's trying to get that pace going and get people scoring. So I think when he comes back, hopefully the hip pointer, I think he's questionable tomorrow. He took some contact today. So I think he should be good to go against the Raptors on New Year's Eve. That gets people excited. As far as Obi Toppin is concerned now, it might be a little different. I think Obi has the one thing that's really impressed me with Obi Toppin is his IQ for the game. He's made a lot of really impressive passes that I don't think gets a lot of credit, because every time you see Obi Toppin, you see incredible dunks, you see athleticism, you see him shooting threes. He's an offensive powerhouse, and we haven't really gotten to see a full, even that one preseason game that he played pretty well, you didn't really get to see the full package. Like a lot of those shots that he made were kind of like, shooters, bounces and rolls, and got a few dunks here and there, easy stuff. But we haven't really got to see the whole repertoire yet. And I think right now, with how good Julius Randle is playing, I don't think it's going to be that much of a detriment to Obi Toppin. I think now the pressure is off from New York City to throw that dude into the starting lineup, right? Like, you got Julius Randle in there who's playing out of his mind. And when you have both of those guys on the court, it's pretty hard to kind of share that court and share those shots, because the way that offense is set up, I think they're going to end up getting a lot of the same sort of shooting opportunities. So when it comes to Obi, I think right now, when he comes back, hopefully in the next few days, or I guess a week or so, he's the perfect spell for Julius Randle. Like, it's the same sort of offense. You don't got to really change much out of him. You don't got to run stuff for him. They have pretty similar body types, similar athleticism. Probably Obi's probably a little bit more athletic than Julius Randle, but I think it's gonna serve those guys well, getting to kind of sit and watch from the sideline. And granted that they keep this effort up in the next game, they don't want to come and mess anything up, so they want to come in and keep that thing going, especially the way that second unit is run. I mean, the first preseason games, everything we saw that got us excited came from that second unit. Kevin Knox coming off the bench, Quickly coming off the bench, Obi Toppin coming off the bench. So I think it bolsters the depth of the Knicks, and there's a possibility there could be some fun games this season where, they're not going to really be out of it, because they can go to the bench and have some young, exciting scoring talent to come in and either get the energy up or keep the energy up.
I love all the optimism with everything we're talking about here with the young guys. And I'm curious if you think that trend continues with RJ Barrett, because he's had, I think, quite a wild start to the season. Is just a difficult guy to judge in general, because starts off with 26 points, terrific game against the Pacers, but really struggling afterwards in terms of shooting the ball. I mean, under 50%. I don't even think he's made a three yet in those games since the opener. So second year now, I think, what do you kind of want to see from RJ Barrett that gives you some sort of confidence about his future, like you have with a lot of these other players?
Like I said this sort of in the beginning, it's a make or miss league. And the great thing I've watched about these Knicks is that they get good shots. Like, if you watch their offense, like, you're not seeing a lot of people taking contested shots, shooting into traffic, getting their shot punched from the three-point line or whatever. Granted, that a lot has to do with Julius Randle and drawing a lot of that defense and getting those open guys their shots open. So I'm not necessarily worried. I think RJ is eventually going to figure it out. And the one thing I have wanted to see with him, that would make me excited for his potential, is kind of what I'm seeing right now. how is he going to react to adversity? How's he going to react when his shots aren't falling? And, that chip on his shoulder that he's had all season about not being named to the all-rookie team. Is he going to press? Is he going to try and take away shots from, players that are playing better than him? Is he going to feel like, all these things that he wants to do are going to come at the detriment of the team? And he hasn't done that at all. When his shots haven't been falling, he's been rebounding the ball well. He's been playing really good defense. He's made some incredible passes to Mitch Robinson and Julius Randle. I just want to see that all-around game. These guys are NBA players. We've seen people that are way worse shooters than RJ Barrett eventually become knockdown, consistent three-point shooters. So the kid's just he's a half a day over 20 years old already. He's super young. He's got the pedigree. I'm not worried about him eventually becoming a great scorer in this league, because there's a certain knack that he has to attacking that rim, getting to the free throw line. He's shooting the free throws a little bit better. And, just being able to get points when your shot necessarily isn't falling. Once that shot begins to fall, though, watch out. We saw it in the first regular season game when he couldn't miss, and we were watching him, and we're just saying, this dude is looking like every bit the future all-star shooting guard that he was projected to be since high school. You know what I mean? So I'm sure we'll see a lot of that soon, but right now, what I'm seeing, I like that the way he's responded to not being able to shoot well. Just doing other things to help your team. You don't necessarily need to get buckets all the time to help contribute to winning basketball, and he's young enough to know that.
Kaz, we've been talking a lot, and I feel like there's been a lot of discussion about the Knicks players and how much they've bought into Tom Thibodeau, the culture, the behavior, and we've seen that in the first few games. But to sort of reverse that, how much do you also think that Tom Thibodeau has adapted to this group of players, the young guys, the veterans? How good of a job do you think he's done in maybe adapting his style a little bit into a way that works for this specific Knicks team and this specific group of players?
Well, the one thing I've noticed from him is he's really sort of embraced analytics, which, you look at Tom Thibodeau and he's every bit the old school, gruffy, gritty 90s sort of head coach that just kind of the drill sergeant. But, you might not necessarily see it during a game, but if you watch some of his post-game comments, some of the stuff that he talks about in the press conference, he mentions a lot about plus minus. He talks a lot about people getting great shots. He said this consistently throughout the season about players that I've been skeptical about, guys like Kevin Knox, guys like Frank Ntilikina. And he's literally said, they're good shots. When they take good shots, they go in. And the one consistent that's been throughout preseason and 4 games into the regular season is that the Knicks get really good shots. They get them open. They just got to knock them down, and you don't get those sort of specifics and analytics without great coaching and being able to know where these players fit best. I think Tom Thibodeau, when you look at him and see that, his history with Derrick Rose and turning him into an MVP. And I kind of feel like everybody looked at that point guard position and was like, oh man, like this guy's, you're going to be, the pupil, you're going to be the star pupil under the Thibodeau tree, because if there's anything he does, he's make point guards really well. And the fact that Dennis Smith Jr. hasn't played that well, Austin Rivers has been hurt. Alfred Payton's been up and down. And who else? Emmanuel Quickly's been hurt. The fact that he had the knowledge of self to, evolve Julius Randle into a point forward and say, hey, this guy's the best playmaker on the team. Maybe he's not like Chris Webber, Vlade Divac, Nikola Jokic, like this incredibly good passer. But what he does really well is draw attention. And I'm pretty sure Tibbs and Payne and Woodson have drove it into him like, hey, you see how easy it was for you to get into the paint all last year, and you didn't really trust your teammates, and you used to do spin moves and do anything you can to score a bucket. Look how many people around you. Now look at all these guys that I brought in to help you out. We got Reggie Bullock for you, Alec Burks, Alfred's getting better, Frank's shooting the ball well, Kevin Knox shooting the ball well. Just kick it to these dudes. Get them open shots, man. And he's drawn a lot of attention because Randall's getting buckets. And Tibbs, I want to say his demeanor and the way that he's kind of adapted his old school style into this new school sort of way of playing ball is that everybody's positionless. everybody could be a playmaker, right? And whoever gets the ball, unless you're like Mitchell Robinson, just get it and go. Just run. You know, like you don't got to slow the ball down and start your offense with 17 seconds on the clock. Just push it, put pressure on that defense, and let them make a decision. And I think he's done a really good job with that, especially Julius Randle. If Julius Randle continues on this tear, Tom Thibodeau is going to be getting a whole lot of Coach of the Year nominations because they were. I mean, as a fellow Knicks fan, people were waiting for Julius Randle with pitchforks, ready to run him out of town, include him in every single trade package. And not to say that has changed so much. I'm sure if the right package came along, Knicks fans would still probably be willing to do away with them. But right now, right this second, on 5/18 on Wednesday, December 30th. I don't think anybody would be happy trading Julius Randle at the moment. So I'm excited for that.
As a Randall fan, I would say I feel verified now that this is happening. But I do want to ask, I'm not going to ask you for a prediction about the Knicks season in general, because I think it's difficult to judge considering those injuries that you mentioned. I just don't think that's fair. But I'm more curious from a broad NBA perspective. We've seen the Knicks as a casualty of all these injuries. We saw a lot of blowouts these past couple of days, 50-point game, 45-point games. Is that type of disparity between the injuries, between the blowouts in this shortened season with that short off season, is that at all a concern about what we're going to see in this NBA season as a whole?
I don't think it's a concern. I do think it's going to be something that we see a lot, though. I mean, like we kind of got like the perfect storm of terrible blowouts that we're going to see, right? We got a short off season. You got people that are going to be injured. We got no crowd. Like there's a lot of times when you're down 20 points, and I don't know if you guys have played basketball before, but like you hit 1 or 2 shots, cut it to 16, you cut it to 14, that crowd, that rumble kind of starts throughout the arena. And now you're getting energy and adrenaline that you've never even knew you can get it from. That's not going to happen this season. Well, that's not going to happen in a lot of arenas up until, we figure out what's going on with this pandemic. But, there's going to be a lot of things that, for a while, we're going to see some very wonky scores. I think we've seen 2 this week with, the LA Clippers getting punched by 50 points. And then a couple days later, the Miami Heat getting punched by almost 50 points, and the, Bucks breaking a record for threes just days after they couldn't buy a bucket against the New York Knicks. So I feel like we're going to expect that for a while. I think up until maybe February, top of February, maybe after Martin Luther King Day, when people get their sea legs under them. A lot of those injuries aren't as common anymore. And as far as the Knicks are concerned, I'm sure there's going to be those games where they look like the same old Knicks where they get punched by 40. But I feel like everybody should just take into account these are not regular times. These are not simple NBA seasons that we can all have a litmus test of we can compare it to other seasons. You can't compare this to any other season. You can't even really compare this to the bubble. This is extremely different circumstances that we're living in. So, I'm not worried about the Bucks. I think they'll be there at the end. I'm not worried about the Clippers. I think they'll be there at the end. I do think that there'll be these one-off scores that kind of pop out on your NBA app and be like, oh, wow, that's different. But I don't think it's cause for much concern yet.
Yeah, don't mention that Heat game to Alex. But anyway, we'll move on.
My
from
Heat
that.
sneakers over there. I don't have it with me for a reason.
Hey, what could you do sometimes? But Kaz, before we let you go, I wanted to ask, you're involved in a project, the Springhill Company, reading from part of the mission statement now. It seeks to empower greatness in every individual, from creators to consumers. If you don't mind, can you just tell us a little bit more about that project, your involvement in it, and what drew you to take part in that?
Well, yeah, man, I've had a great relationship with Springhill Company and Uninterrupted for a number of years now. I've hosted shows with them. I've hosted projects. I've always kind of been like their de facto non-athlete host, once Uninterrupted was more of like an athlete-based program. And earlier this past year, there was an opportunity to come on in more of an official term as a creative executive for a lot of their audio projects. So, it's an incredible place to be, obviously. I mean, it's fun to have a West Coast team to cheer for. So, when LeBron does good, we all do good. But as far as the audio projects are concerned, currently, I showrun and executive produce a podcast with DJ Khaled called The First One on Amazon Music exclusively, which is one of Spring Hill's biggest out of sports projects, right? Like a lot of the stuff that they do is, very sports based or Space Jam or, lots of stuff within the sports realm, More Than a Vote, and, all these things that LeBron and Mav Carter take very seriously into heart. And this music project with DJ Khaled is something that is, we believe, is going to really grow the company's clientele as far as being like an authority in the music space. Before I was, really doing a lot of sports content. My roots are in hip hop, man. Like I was editor at the Source magazine for 4 years. I was editor at Hip Hop Wired. I ran translation. Stash that translation with Steve Stout, who's now the chief advisor to the Knicks. And most of these artists and guys that are out right now are people I've either grew up with or been friends with for a long time. So yeah, man. So the first one is especially trippy for me because we're talking to these incredible, iconic artists about their first hit record, and DJ Khaled is interviewing them. You know what I mean? Like it's different if I'm interviewing you. It's different if a pro journalist is interviewing these artists. But DJ Khaled gets things out of these artists that nobody can. And current episodes that we have right now, if you haven't checked it out, you go to Amazon Music. We've done episodes with Lil Wayne, Puff Daddy, Fat Joe, Kelly Rowland, J Balvin, Big Sean, Rick Ross, T.I., Bryson Tiller, Nas, just, some of the greatest to ever do it, and talking about and bringing them back to a time before they were, the big, kahuna, some of the biggest artists in the world. So it's really a fun project, man. Like, and Khaled, working with DJ Khaled is incredible because he doesn't take a day off. That's him. Like that excitement, that enthusiasm that you see with him, and another one, and We the Best, and Bless Up, and all that type of stuff. That is him to a T. So kind of like tag teaming him with him on this project has been an incredibly great experience, and I can't wait to do 10 more seasons of the podcast, man. It's really fun.
And you listed off a lot of iconic names. One other one that gave you a shout out before we let you go here was Clyde Frazier, because we saw the bite on the internet. The stickers that aren't back there right now are the Pumas that you showed off on the show. Just curious. Oh, you got him. You gonna bring him out for us?
I got a pair. I got some RS Dreamers. Shout out to Dreamville. Shout out J. Cole. Love these.
Looking for
Super
those
Mario editions. But yeah, man. Clyde. I've met Clyde. The funny thing is, the first time I met Clyde was the beginning of last season. Was at the the big Puma reveal for RJ Barrett, Kevin Knox, and himself. So I kind of moderated this conversation between like all these generations, and Clyde is the absolute coolest dude, like cooler than a cheetah, just a smooth cat, man. And you see him, and like you remember like Chappelle's show when like Rick James walked in with like the aura and stuff like that. Like that's what Clyde Frazier walks in with. Like he walks in with that sort of aura. So when I'm watching the game, and I knew that this bump is gonna come in between like free throws or whatever about the video game sweepstakes, hearing Clyde Frazier like rhyme my name, I was like, I'm good. I'm done. You can put it on my tombstone. Put it on my resume. Call me Jazzy Kaz from now on, because it's a one thing to do MSG AM, which I love doing, and it's some of the most funnest stuff I've ever done. Monica McNutt is an incredible co-host. She makes this show so fun and so easy. But on top of that, man, like I'm a lifer when it comes to the Knicks. Like, since it's the only team I've ever rooted for, it's the only team I've ever really even cared for. I mean, I love basketball, I love the NBA, and I love the game, but when you're a New Yorker, like it's the Knicks, and that's all it is. So I get to wake up and live my dream every day, man. Talk about Knicks basketball. Have Clyde and Mike Breen shout you out in the middle of a Knicks game. I'm like, is this life? What's going on right here? But it's tight, man. It's really incredible, and I'm keeping Jazzy Kaz. So shout out to Clyde Frazier for the nickname. Not many people on earth can say Walt Claude Frazier gave him a nickname, and I could say that. So that makes me feel really good.
There you have it. Jazzy Kazeem Famuyide, co-host of MSG AM from 8 to 9, Monday through Friday with Monica McNutt. You can catch Kaz and Monica on the show every morning. Kaz, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it. Happy New Year to you and yours.
Thank you guys, man. I love the show. I love what you guys do. I love that it's been long running for as much as it has. And shows like this are extremely important, man. Like, you got to keep the medium alive. You got to be able to keep doing what you're doing. So I really do appreciate you. And whenever you guys want me back, I'll be more than happy to come through.
Appreciate
Right
it.
back at you. We'll talk to you soon.
One-on-One has a brand new YouTube channel. Subscribe to WFUV Sports to catch our simulcast Saturday nights and get notifications so you never miss another show. Miss the show? You can find on-demand segments, interviews, and highlights every week. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Welcome back to One-on-One, New York's longest running sports call-in show, taking you up until 2 a.m. here in the East in the last half hour of our show. Still a lot to get into. Alongside Alex Walls, I'm Jimmy Sullivan. Kayla Wenzel will join us in a bit. But going behind the curtain here on One-on-One, we sit here every week. We come up with a rundown, and we have a certain idea of what we're going to talk about entering a show. And as part of that, we usually meet every Friday afternoon before a Saturday show and go through what we're going to talk about that week. So we had our meeting yesterday, 5 o'clock. Not yesterday, Friday, I should say, technically. And we had our meeting at Friday at 5. And I'm watching Alabama Notre Dame, and it's a blowout. And I'm convinced we're going to be talking about Alabama Clemson again at this time during the show, because I was just not convinced that Ohio State was going to keep up with Clemson. And I thought we were going to get another rematch, and we were going to have a conversation about some more of the existential issues of college football. That did not happen on Friday night. Justin Fields was incredible for Ohio State. He throws for 6 touchdowns. He takes a hit that most people would not have withstood. He did. Played a great game. Ohio State, after being ranked 11th in Dabo Swinney's final coaches poll, defeats Clemson 49-28, and they are off to the national championship game. Alex, so much to react to here, but what was your reaction to watching Ohio State really take it to Clemson in that semifinal?
So I had stepped away from the game for a couple minutes when it was about 14-14, came back, and it was just a blowout. I was like, this is unheard of in terms of seeing Clemson, a team that has been at the top of the table every year, unbeatable, unstoppable. They got walloped by Ohio State. This game was not even close. I mean, Ohio State, this is a team who we were talking just a couple weeks ago, concerns about Fields, concerns about this. You talked about existential concerns about the playoff. We had them about Ohio State, too. We thought this wasn't going to be close. And they come out and they don't only compete, they win this game handedly, and I think it sets up a really intriguing final and also a really interesting conversation about this college football season.
It's really funny because you look at the playoff throughout its history, there have been 14 semifinal games, 11 decided by 11 or more, average margin of victory over 20. And if you would have told me this game would have been decided by 21 points, I would have said, well, yeah, Clemson's going to win. That's the way it's going to go. That's not what happened at all. And credit to Ohio State. But I want to stay with Clemson here because we talked on College Gridiron, myself, Nick DeLuca, Ryan Gregware. You can go listen to it on WFUVsports.org. We were previewing the playoff game, so it's a bit outdated by now. But the three of us were talking about how Dabo Swinney left a stupid amount of bulletin board material for Ohio State. And he had talked about how, they were ranked 11th in his coach's poll. He defended that. I don't know if he actually does his coach's poll or if he outsources it. Who knows? He also said that Ohio State had only played 6 games, so there wasn't a lot of film to watch. And this in addition to the fact that Clemson beat Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl last year. So you knew Ohio State was going to come out hot. The question was sustaining it. But this is going to be a long offseason for Clemson. They're going to lose Trevor Lawrence most likely. Dabo Swinney said what he said, did what he did. And at the end of the day, despite all of that, Clemson still got run off the field by Ohio State, who I think shockingly to a lot of people, including myself, looked like the much better team last night.
If this was just an ordinary college football playoff game, I really would not have had much weight. I would have said, okay, let's see. It's going to be a fun game. I don't really care what happens, though. The second Dabo Swinney said what he said, I was all aboard the Ohio State bandwagon. And I think you and I were talking a little bit yesterday. We were just happy. We were so happy to see this because there was a certain arrogance from the Clemson camp that just had no reason to exist. Anybody in their right mind, I think, knows that Ohio State is not the 11th best team in the country. I know that they only played 6 games. I know that it wasn't an ordinary season. They beat, though, what are some actually pretty high caliber teams, as we saw with Northwestern. I think Indiana is going to be a good team as we see them in their bowl game. They had some good wins against some pretty decent teams. And I think we kind of should have expected better from them in the playoff. And Dabo Swinney just downplayed them for no good reason. And then, well, he paid for it ultimately. And I think this is a game that I would not have really had a lot of weight in. But because of those comments, I was really behind Ohio State and really happy to see them win this game because even though they didn't look terrific throughout the entire season, there was this narrative about them that I think was a little bit unfortunate. Now it's good to see them kind of right the ship here at the end of the season.
Ohio State's 1 win away from a national championship. They play Alabama on January 11th. And let's move over to Ohio State because Justin Fields, this is one of the best performances I've ever seen in college football. 6 TDs. He takes the hit in the second quarter from Brett Skalski, who gets ejected for targeting, which was a controversial thing. But Fields it looked like mangled by that hit, basically. And he was grimacing when he was throwing on the sideline. He just looked off. And yet he comes out in the second half, throws some bombs for touchdowns. He did throw 1 interception, but he was so good. And I think that silenced a lot of the doubters, not just of Ohio State, but also of him, that he could step up in a big game after what we saw last year. He was incredible. Just shout out to him for what he went through during that game, getting hurt, coming back. Just tremendous stuff, I thought, Alex, from Justin Fields.
I'm fully with you. That was one of the most impressive performances I've seen from a quarterback. I'm not even going to say a college quarterback. All things considered, the kid threw for 6 touchdowns, and he looked injured the entire time it was happening. I mean, you saw him on the sideline grimacing on the exercise bike. He came out today and said that, they kind of just gave him a quick shot and he was good to go. No real diagnosis, no real sense of whether he was even okay or not. And that's a whole separate conversation. But this was a guy who throughout the season has kind of struggled. I know he had a brilliant year last year. I thought he was phenomenal. And this year, a bit of a step back. I don't really think we can look too much into that because of the weirdness of the season. But he came out in this playoff game, and really the only game that counts, because those 6 regular season games, they're in the rearview mirror now. They got them in the playoff, and that's all they needed to do, no matter how it came. Now we're on the real big stage here that Ohio State's always wanted to be at, and there was the revenge game in his mind, there was the narrative in his mind, there was all these things going on, and he came, like you said, Jimmy, and shut all of it down with, I think, a really, really impressive performance. I mean, you look at the numbers, he only missed 6 passes on the day, 385 yards, 6 touchdowns. That's incredible. Just there's no real other word for it, and it's very impressive and very good to see for a guy who's been downplayed this entire season.
By the way, I just want to correct something. I referenced someone named Brett Skalski before. It's James Skalski. It's 1:40 in the morning. Forgive me. I'm sorry. But nonetheless, it's funny because I was watching it last night, and I think I've talked myself back into a Justin Fields Jets Photoshop.
That's the thing.
But we were saying that first it was Lawrence, and then they beat the Rams, so that's out. And then it was Zach Wilson. And then it was, maybe stick with Sam Darnold, which they might ultimately do, which I actually would probably be in favor of. And then it's, maybe it's Justin Fields. And the when I knew it was really crazy last night, Alex, when I knew we had reached a new dimension, was when Adam Schefter tweeted out the Jaguars Justin Fields supercut. I said, like, no, that's not going to happen unless Trevor Lawrence goes back to Clemson, which is unlikely.
It's interesting because you got to think, how much do you weigh this game? Because look, I think it'd be foolish to say just because of one game we're going to throw away Trevor Lawrence's entire college career and this entire season for Justin Fields. But if you're in that number 1 pick and you're the Jaguars, if you take Lawrence, this is going to be in the back of your mind. There's not a chance that this is the one time really before the draft that we're seeing these two guys on the same stage, and Fields convincingly won. I mean, there's not even a question about it. And I think, look, I'm not saying that should really impact the decision. Lawrence is a better quarterback. I think he's going to be a better player. But this is something that you're going to have to consider and always going to be lingering in the back of your head, that Fields looked like this the one time they played.
Yeah, it's in the back of your mind, yes.
The back, yes.
But Trevor Lawrence is the guy.
I agree.
Like if the Jaguars pass on Trevor Lawrence and he falls to the Jets at 2, like I will personally mail a check to Shad Khan. Like, but it's not going to happen. But it's like it's funny to think about how everyone's been tanking for Trevor Lawrence and that he doesn't wind up being the number 1 pick. And it's actually funny because now that I think of it, you had Suck for Sam with Sam Darnold. He fell to the Jets at 3. You had Tank for Tua. He fell to the Dolphins at 6 or 5?
7.
Like he fell. He wasn't number 1. I think he was 6 and Herbert was 7.
Yeah, that's it.
It was 5 and 6, something like that. But he wasn't number 1. Joe Burrow was number 1.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny to think about. We have these like preconceived notions of what the draft's going to look like going into college football season. I think this is the case where it will stay with Trevor Lawrence at number 1. But it is funny to think about how, okay, we're, from an organizational standpoint, we're going to do a certain thing, and oh no, we might not get him, and then he falls to you anyway. And the Dolphins actually did that last year, where everybody was mad at them for winning, and they still got to it anyway. So it winds up working out. It always does. But it's going back to college football now. Let's take a look ahead to the national title game. Ohio State, Alabama. Alabama's opened as a 7-point favorite. I saw last night. Not sure if that's held yet or not, but Alabama's going to be favored going into this one. Game in Miami. I'm excited for this matchup. I think it's really interesting. I had not thought of this matchup when thinking about the national title game, but we're here, and I think this matchup, the Ohio State O-line, the Bama front 7, I think that's actually going to be a really good matchup. I'm looking forward to it a lot. It's something different.
It's certainly more exciting than I think we were expecting initially. And I actually think it's more interesting than an Alabama-Clemson because it's just different. Like, I think we've seen, they have great showdowns every time, those two, but it's good to see something different. And yeah, I think it's interesting from a matchup perspective because what was Notre Dame's only chance was just the physicality against Alabama. That was the only way they were ever going to compete in that game. But they didn't have nearly enough firepower that Alabama did. But now you're looking at a team in Ohio State who's clearly got a quarterback that can throw the football and really put up some points. And you also have a team that's very physical. And we saw them manhandle Clemson on the line of scrimmage, which was really unheard of. And I think if they can bring, I'm not going to expect it necessarily, but if they can bring that same aggression and that same ability to throw the football and also run the ball, they were very effective in all facets of the game. If they can do that against an Alabama team that has looked very difficult to beat, but when they have against teams that can score the football, I think you're actually going to have a pretty interesting final. And look, Ohio State, it might be an overreaction after what we just saw, but you have to think they can compete after what they just did to Clemson.
Just something to watch for Ohio State. Wyatt Davis, their star offensive lineman, got hurt in the second half of that game. I did see him on social media making fun of Dabo Swinney afterwards, so I assume he's okay. Yeah. But a storyline to watch for the national title game. Interesting times in college football, interesting times in the world. It's 2021. Finally, we're looking ahead to the year ahead in sports and some things we're hoping for out of our teams, maybe as well. 15 minutes left on One. Join us after the break. We'll be right back.
One on One has a brand new YouTube channel. Subscribe to WFUV Sports to catch our simulcast Saturday nights and get notifications so you never miss another show. Miss the show? You can find on-demand segments, interviews, and highlights every week. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
To support the WFUV Sports Department, visit support.wfuv.org to become a member or make a one-time donation. WFUV Sports, home to New York's longest-running sports call-in show and the flagship station of Fordham Athletics.
Last few minutes here of One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. We're on 90.7. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. Alex, Kayla, and Jimmy with you here this morning, I should say. And it's a new year. We've turned a new leaf. I think basically everyone was happy to see this year go in the rear view. And we have made it to 2021. Now, the change of the calendar does not mean things are magically changed, but this time represents hope for a lot of people, and I think for the three of us as well. And one area we could look for some hope is sports, and we all have things we're looking for in the new year, things we're hoping for, I'm sure. And I will turn this over to you guys. I'll let you go first. Kayla, I'll go to you first. What is one thing, maybe the biggest thing, just anything that you're hoping to see in sports, whether it be with your teams or sports in general, as we head into this new year of 2021?
Well, I think I'd like to attend a game. I think that's maybe asking too much right now, honestly. I'm not sure that that'll be in the cards for us in 2021, but I would love to be sitting at a baseball stadium in 2021 in July or something like that, wearing my mask, socially distanced. That's something I'd like to see. Specifically for my teams, I would really like to see the Phillies go to the playoffs. They're going on 10 years now. I think the last time they were there was 2011.
Yeah.
So it's been a long slump to be a Phillies fan. So I'm high hopes that maybe we'll be in the playoffs this year.
And maybe you'll get to go if it's in October, depending.
And maybe I'll get to go. That would be icing on top of the cake. Am I right?
I agree with that. I think the whole idea of going back to games is like such a foreign concept now. And it's like, I would just crave to be at a basketball court again for me. I mean, in so many other places, but I think just in general, like they talked about this a little bit before on the show, we've talked about it before, is how grateful we are just to have sports and how nice it is to see and to have games and to have championships and things that matter. Getting that back is really great, but being there in person, I think, is a whole nother element. And for me, I think the first time that hit was NBA opening night. I'm a big Steph Curry guy. When the Warriors came to town to play Brooklyn, that would have been like the greatest thing to go to. And when that, happened and nobody can be there, I think that was a real like shot in the heart of like, oh man, that one hurts. So like Yeah, I think getting to be back at games again is certainly a big part of it. But for me as an NBA fan, I'm just excited to see some basketball again with some players that I love. I mean, we're getting so many guys back this year. Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, John Wall. Just the NBA is kind of back to where I think it should be in terms of guys are healthy again, guys are competing again. And whether we can be there or not in person, just seeing that, seeing guys healthy on the court again, I think that's such a great feeling after not having it for so many months and for some even years with some of these guys.
Yeah, it's really interesting you guys bring up these points. I mean, I watch games on the couch now because I don't go to games anymore. And it's funny because you sit there and you see, some places have fans and you, I don't want to say cringe because that's
I do.
strong.
I'll agree with you.
Yeah, I don't cringe anymore because there's a lot of strong evidence, like when the games are outdoors, that there's not, added spread as opposed to, whatever else we're doing. So I don't cringe, but I do wince a little bit, like when I see some of these college football games, like especially this year with like Texas A&M, where they're like on top of each other. and there was a field goal and they all like went nuts and they were like jumping on top of each other. I said, okay. So that, that wasn't terrific, but I do look forward to seeing like a packed house and a rowdy environment without that added, like, oh, I hope nothing bad happens here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that, but I think moving on to a more on the field, on the court aspect, you guys are setting kind of long-term goals. I'm going to be a little bit more realistic and try for something that I can maybe get by tomorrow, which is I'm hoping for a new coach for the New York Jets. And I think we're going to get it. And I like setting realistic but attainable goals. I'm a big believer in that. And this fits both of the criteria. Everyone thinks and maybe even knows that Adam Gase is going to be gone on Sunday night or Monday morning, depending on what it is. We're all just waiting for it. And once that happens, I'll be happy. Now, who they get as the next head coach is very important for this team, but you can't fix that until you get rid of the person who's in there right now. So I'll be hoping for that. And I think I'm going to get my New Year's wish first. So, there's that.
You're definitely going to beat me with the Phillies.
See, I'm in such a different boat too because my teams that I'm a fan of have been so successful. Like, I have to be honest, I'm very spoiled here. Like, I'm a Miami Heat guy. Last year was what a treat. I could not have told you in a million years that would have happened for one reason or another. So getting that was terrific. I mean, like I said, Steph Curry, championship after championship, can't complain. Oregon's been competitive. I think there's work to do there, not going to lie, but it's been competitive. I mean, I can't complain. Justin Herbert is balling out in the NFL. I mean, I'm just sitting here enjoying sports. I mean, soccer is a different conversation. We're not going to have that on this show. Different conversation for Jimmy and I. But overall, I can't complain, man. For as bad as 2020 was, I've had a lot of sports teams do a lot of good things, and I just got to build on that in 2021. So for me, it's pretty simple. I know, Kayla, Jimmy, you guys aren't so lucky, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, that must be nice, Alex.
It
I
is.
can't relate.
It is.
So wait, so Kayla, you're a Philly fan, right? Like all the Philly teams? Gosh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's been a tough year. Eagles not doing well. I'll be interested if Doug Peterson is fired on Monday too, like you said, for the Jets. I have mixed feelings about that. I'm not sure. I really like him, but he hasn't done great things with the program. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was fired on Monday, but I wouldn't say that's something I'm hoping for because I do kind of like him. I'm hoping for a better Eagles team, I hope.
It's interesting too. Like, if we could stay on Peterson for a sec, and I am not saying this to make fun of or criticize Philadelphia. I just want to preface it with this.
Okay, good.
But if you look at Doug Peterson's resume, what he's done, he's gotten to the playoffs with 3 times, won a Super Bowl in 5 years. If you put him in city X that is not Philadelphia, like, are we having this conversation? I don't know. I mean, Philly fans are very passionate, and I mean that in a good way, because they bring it. But I do wonder, like, are we having this conversation if Doug Peterson is in Atlanta? Because I think Atlanta is actually a pretty good example because Dan Quinn's a guy who went to the Super Bowl, had gone to the playoffs a couple of times. And was in this situation after year 5. They let him come back this year, and then they fired him in 5 games or whatever it wound up being. So I do wonder if the Philadelphia fandom and the passion that people in Philly have is at all driving this conversation, in addition to the obvious other structural issues with the Eagles.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, like, yeah, when you look at his record, like purely on paper, it's pretty good. Like he has not been a terrible coach for us, especially after like Andy Reid. Like he's been a really welcome like breath of fresh air for us here in Philly. But because we are so passionate, I think that people had such high expectations for the team this year. Carson Wentz was healthy. Like I just think that Philly fans were hoping for a lot more than we got, and that maybe our disappointment and our emotions are driving our decisions about Peterson right now. Maybe they're not actually going to be the best. But I don't know. I definitely do think that being in Philadelphia and what the fans expect out of Peterson is going to determine whether or not he has a job next year.
I think Philly's a bit of an anomaly because if you look at this season, you would think that with the coach that they have, Peterson, with Wentz, that this would be like they could clean this division up and no problem when it's 5-6 win teams are at the top of it. So I think for Philly to just crumble the way they have, I hate to use that word, Kale, but for that to happen, I think is just so concerning. But I want to switch 1 second to basketball because finals predictions, we're not good at those on this show. I know Jimmy and I can attest to that, but I think the Sixers are going to be in the finals. I know that's a little out there. That's my prediction. I think Doc Rivers has control of that team. I love Joel Embiid. I think they're talented enough to get there. So if we're talking about a good note for Philly, I think that's going to happen, and that's what I'd like to see this year.
Yeah, it's interesting. I picked Milwaukee again because I can't help myself, and yeah, I am. At some point, they're actually part of it was too with Giannis. Like there is a large sample size of like great NBA players winning in their 8th year, and that's where Giannis is now. So I think they're getting ready to go over the edge. Whether that happens this year or not, who knows? I am happy that he signed that extension in Milwaukee because I would much rather see him try to do it there than go to Miami or go to LA. But beside that, I actually don't think that's that out there anymore. I mean, the Nets are unhealthy. The Bucks, you don't know. I mean, they're a question mark all the time, it seems. And you look around the East, I mean, Miami not off to a great start. Boston, do you have enough trust in them? I don't know. Indiana is all right, but they're not at that level. So, yeah, I don't think you're crazy on that, Alex. Like you said, it was a hot take. I don't view that as a hot take at all.
I appreciate that, Jimmy. Now it's going to come true. I'm confident.
Yeah, no.
I hope so.
I just see. I just gave you the kiss of death. So that's what happens. That's what happens when I say something's going to happen. It's just the opposite.
Hey, we'll see.
Jimmy ruined the 76ers season already.
Let me ask questions. Does anybody have a resolution or a hope for the year not sports related? Is anything out there? Because like I said at the beginning, I'm not a big resolution guy. I just think every year you got to get a little bit better. But anything else out there for either of you?
I mean, I was in a restaurant this time last year, so I'm trying not to go too far with this. No, I it's hard to. I'm just going to try not to take things for granted. Like, because I think that's what this year taught us. But I don't know if that's so much of a resolution. It's just something I had already been trying to do that I'm going to try continuing to do.
Yeah, I normally make them, but 2020 showed me I have no control. So I'm not making any this year. I'm just going to let this year be as it's going to be.
Yeah, they probably got all blown up anyway, so I kind of agree with you, yeah.
Well, hopefully next year we could actually like see each other in person. That'd be good.
Yes.
Again, the standards are low right now. I can't lie, but the standards are low, but hopefully 2021 will be better than last year. Guys, this has been great to be with you today. Happy New Year. And this has been a lot of fun. Sports director of WFUV is Bobby Shaffordini. Today's producer has been Alex Foles. And for Alex and Kayla Wenzel on the headlines, I'm Jimmy Sullivan saying so long until next week. One on One is a production of WFUV Sports.